Good afternoon, ministers, ambassadors, and distinguished guests. Thank you for joining us today for the OECD's inaugural high-level conference on how to prevent, address, and ultimately end intimate partner violence. My name is Flora Monsaingeon, and I work here at the OECD in the Public Affairs and Communications Directorate. When the organizers of today's event asked me to MC, I knew this would not be an easy role. This can be a difficult topic to address in public and in private, and it evokes strong emotions. Many of our speakers at this conference are motivated by personal experiences of violence, and I imagine that many of you in this room know firsthand of someone who has experienced this kind of trauma. And yet, we must address this topic with even more determination, including at the highest levels of government, in order to bring about any positive change. We are long overdue in prioritizing this issue. I hope that the conference agenda over the next 2 days will inspire and inform us. We'll be talking about what governments and relevant stakeholders can do to better address the important issue of intimate partner violence. The content and discussions at this conference will touch on the topics of physical violence, sexual violence, and other types of abuse. Some of these conversations may be emotionally and intellectually challenging to hear. Please feel free to consult the agenda prior to each session, and know that you are free to step out of the room during any session that may be challenging to hear. Before we begin, I just wanted to share a few logistical details about the event. We have quite a packed room today. For those of you standing in the back of the room, please know that there is a listening room in CC7, which is just across the hall. We don't have assigned seating in this room, so if you did not get a seat for this opening session, please come back earlier for the next panels, and you'll probably find a seat. This conference is being simultaneously interpreted in English and in French. You can find headsets broadcasting the interpretation at your seat. And please note also that the event is being live streamed on the OECD YouTube channel. The moderators of the panel will be taking questions on Twitter. In addition to questions from the audience, we encourage you to send your questions via Twitter during the sessions so that they can be collected and shared with the moderators. We will be collecting the questions through the hashtag and violence against women, which is also the hashtag of this event. Now that we've covered these important logistical details, let's begin the conference. I'm very pleased to be able to pass the microphone to a long-standing, dedicated advocate to gender equality, the Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Angel Gurría. The Secretary General will deliver the conference's opening remarks. He will be followed by Minister Marlène Schiappa of France, secrétaire d'État auprès du Premier ministre, chargée de l'égalité entre les femmes et les...
Who is Secretary of State in charge of equality between women and men.
Mr. Secretary General, I hand the microphone to you.
Ministers, ambassadors, dear friends, welcome to the OECD High-Level Conference on Ending Violence Against Women. I welcome you very cordially, but also with a heavy heart, with sadness, because I wish we were not here today, not for this purpose. I wish that this meeting was not the most important point in my agenda today, even though we're having a council meeting. I wish that all women could stand in front of us and say that, yes, their most basic right is respected. But violence against women remains one of the most widespread one of the most persistent, devastating human rights violations in the world. And this is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that women continue to encounter violence wherever they go, at home, in public, at work. Violence against women remains pervasive in our societies. More than 1 in 3 women worldwide report having experienced physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. And we know that this is perhaps a low estimate because many women are understandably reluctant to disclose that they have been assaulted. It is unacceptable that 21 of the 37 governments which adhere to the OECD gender recommendations list violence against women as one of the 3 most urgent gender equality issues in their countries. It is unacceptable that today we are in 2020, in the 21st century. Our societies still uphold discriminatory social norms that promote harmful masculinity, allowing and sometimes even encouraging men to abuse women and girls. Social norms whereby boys and men are expected to be aggressive. It's not only accepted, it's expected. It is unacceptable that well into the 21st century, many powerful media, many programs, many movies, ads, video games, continue to promote openly harmful gender stereotypes and cross-gender aggression. This is why today and tomorrow we will take a closer look at a tragically common form of violence against women: intimate partner violence. I'm ashamed that so many women wake up every day with physical and mental scars caused by the people they trusted the most: their boyfriends, their husbands, their partners. This violence affects these women throughout their entire lives. It affects their health. It affects their dreams, their desire to participate in regular activities or to work. It affects their ability to care for their families, to care for their loved ones, and even affects their ability to care for themselves. I think of people like Charlotte Kinnear, Luke Hart, who we'll hear from today, whose lives were upended in the most horrific ways. To end intimate partner violence, we need decisive, comprehensive, and viable action. This kind of violence is rarely an isolated one-off incident. It is usually part of a pattern of ongoing abuse. This is why we need a strong, multidimensional response. Now, OECD governments have taken some measured action on this issue. Many are updating their legal frameworks to address violence against women, abolishing discriminatory laws, and implementing strategies to prevent and address violence. Yet, only 133 of the 180 countries covered by the OECD's Social Institution and Gender Index, the so-called CG or CG, criminalize domestic violence. And just 110 treat sexual harassment as a criminal offense. There are steps that governments can and must take to disrupt patterns of intimate partner violence. We need to understand better the magnitude and the root causes of this type of violence. We still lack accurate measurements of the prevalence and the nature of intimate partner violence across countries. Because it's intimate and because it happens with the people you love, you don't report it. We need to collect data more accurately, more regularly, to prevent and de-escalate cycles of intimate partner violence. We need to inform policy action to take decisions about what the laws, the regulations, the codes should say, and to raise awareness about the issue, to raise a loud alarm about the issue. We also need much more systematic whole-of-government action to end intimate partner violence. This requires a comprehensive legal framework to address violence against women, along with society-wide strategies to prevent, protect, and prosecute against intimate partner violence. And we must also ensure that the services developed for survivors of violence actually meet their needs and create additional roadblocks on their path to recovery. We have to avoid this at all costs. Sometimes the solutions are just wrongly designed. The solutions act almost a contrario sensu. And therefore, the question is, how can we avoid this, creating additional roadblocks on the path to recovery? The last thing survivors should worry about is their safety. Not again, not again, not again. Or troubles related to housing, social protection, legal assistance. We should help them there. The diverse range of services they need should be as coordinated and easy to access as possible. Survivors of violence should focus on rebuilding their lives. Now, this is a tough enough battle. They already have a big challenge in their hands. We should make the rest of the support system more easily accessible. We need to get rid of the bottlenecks that stand in the way of justice. Women and girls who are survivors of violence are especially vulnerable when they face the justice system. We need to understand better what survivors need. Make sure that no barriers prevent them from getting the justice that they deserve. And finally, we must change the socio-cultural environment. We must end the shameful social acceptance of violence against women. This means better empowering women and girls in society, but also engaging men and boys to take a stand, to steer away from from a culture that promotes harmful masculinity. What can be more harmful than this empty masculinity? So, ministers, excellencies, if we stick together, if we learn from each other to design better policies, we can end violence against women. I'm inspired by the work that many of you are doing today, are doing already You are our example. You are the source of our inspiration. Your service makes all the difference in helping survivors of violence, in preventing women from having to become survivors in the first place, and in helping us to build peaceful, egalitarian, and compassionate communities. The OECD is at your side, by your side, holding your hand in this fight. Through this conference, we want to promote policy action and help shift social norms, help shift the culture. And we will follow through with this endeavor. Our action plan for gender mainstreaming, the new OECD Working Party on Gender Mainstreaming and Governance, will help us identify and promote good governance practices for ending violence against women. And remember, le combat.
The fight doesn't stop at the end of this conference. It is not about saying, here is what we're going to do in order to alleviate consciences. On the contrary, our fight is intensifying, is exacerbating. It is no longer a fight that these women will have to follow through alone. They are no longer alone. We will no longer leave their side. We owe them that. And now, I have the honor of giving the floor to someone who is a long-standing, ardent and tireless advocate of the cause for women, who works every day to put an end to violence against women. The French Secretary of State for the Prime Minister, responsible for equality between women and men and anti-discrimination policies, Madam Minister Marlène Schiappa. Given her presence at the recent interministerial conference in France for the protection of women against violence and her personal commitment towards this cause, I know that Mrs. Schiappa will inspire us through her knowledge and her ideas. Madam, you have the floor. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Secrétaire.
Thank you, Secretary General. Ministers, Ambassador Jean-Pierre Jouyet, Gabriela Ramos, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be here today at the OECD. For generations now, since antiquity, as anthropologists would say, men have killed their wives, their ex-wives, their partners, their girlfriends, because they consider that they are not a person as such, that they are property, and they prefer to see these women dead rather than free. For generations now, the French society and the world has considered that the status quo is a fatality, that there is nothing that could be done against men who kill women who die. And the word femicide, that was only used by activists, remain largely unknown from the general public. But it's been a few years now that the French society has woken up, and femicide is a word that is used in our institutions up to the highest levels of government by Emmanuel Macron and in official French documents. And President Emmanuel Macron at the UN urged countries to set up a legal framework to define femicide. In France, women take to the streets to say that they have had enough of murders, violence, and complacency. After Me Too, we talked a lot about the fact that women have finally spoken out. I think it's more about society finally listening. Women have been telling their story for years, but no one's been listening to them. And what's changed today is that people listen to these women. The French president has proclaimed that gender equality is the great cause of his 5-year term, and he urged the UN world leaders to make this a global cause. Domestic violence was addressed through a national consultation, the Grenelle of IPV in France, bringing together government, CSOs, local governments, victims of intimate partner violence, families of women who were victims of femicide, and they were all welcomed to these events to hear what everyone had to say and to table proposals. 100 measures emerged from these discussions. These are groups of people who don't often interact. The police, healthcare, institutions, the justice system, they all came together to see what we could do for these women. What we see today is that there is no country in the world who has reached gender equality, including France. No country has managed to put an end to gender-based violence or patriarchal violence. This observation means that as government representatives, we must be humble and be ready to work together to share best practices. If no country has managed to end violence against women, a number of countries have taken effective measures, and we need to draw inspiration from those measures. In July, we'll have the pleasure of organizing the Generation Equality Forum in Paris, under the aegis of UN Women, and we will be co-chairing with Mexico, and I'd like to welcome my Mexican colleagues here in the room. It's a great pleasure to share this responsibility with Mexico and organize and co-chair this Generation Equality Forum in April in Mexico City and in Paris in July. And this will be an opportunity to discuss these topics, including ending violence against women, and it will be an opportunity also to listen to experts, to women and to CSOs working in this area. I would like to pay tribute to all the women who've been fighting to end domestic violence, violence against women, a fight that puts their own life at risk, because women are under threat the world over, and it's important to support these women. And I'd like to think here to have a special thought for Nasrin Sotoudeh, an Iranian activist who's in prison for her activities. I sadly, unfortunately, won't be able to stay with you throughout the 2 days of conference, but I believe that you'll have a survivor come here to talk to you, and I don't know if she's already in the room, but if that's the case, I would like to personally support her in this endeavor, because it's very hard, difficult to come up on stage and talk about what you've experienced. I think also it's important to keep in mind there are, on the one side, women who are victims, and on the other side, women who act to end violence. We are all women, and statistically speaking, given the number of women in this room, there are victims of gender-based violence, sexual violence, or intimate partner violence, and I don't want to go into the details of the consequences of such violence because you are very fully aware of the impacts. The Grenelle on intimate partner violence was an opportunity to organize 11 topical working groups to come up with measures to better prevent acts of violence, better protect victims, and better prosecute perpetrators. Beyond the legislative measures that France has taken that I don't want to list here, but I wanted to nevertheless mention that this draft bill recognizes the existence of coercive control and psychological hold. The also recognizes forced suicide. We've also enshrined in law that violent men who hold weapons will see their guns confiscated, because there have been cases where women did file a complaint, but nothing was done and the perpetrator had a gun. And so we also have measures to support women in their legal pathway. But beyond these legislative measures, and as the Secretary General said very eloquently, there's a cultural war that we need to wage, a communication war. You can create as many rights as you want for women. If women don't have access to those rights, if they don't even know they have those rights, it means that those rights simply don't exist. We have a helpline in France for women who've experienced IPV. The number is 1319. When I arrived at my position, I realized that only 8% of French population know that this number exists. So there's a helpline, but no one knows it exists. So it's as if it didn't exist. And so we organized the Grenelle for IPV, which started on the 3rd of September 2019. So that's the numbers of their helpline, and the number of people who are aware of this helpline has risen drastically. We've increased the financial and human resources of the helpline. Then there's the issue of supporting women in finding refuge and finding accommodation. So once a woman has filed a complaint, you need to guarantee their protection. So we've increased the number of places in refuges, in shelters, and we've also created, with an organization called Action Logement, a state guarantee system so that these women can rent out a accommodation and the state will guarantee the deposit. The Grenelle was also an opportunity to identify the weak links in France. The French state, was doing very little to deal with perpetrators. I've been engaged in these issues since I was aged 15. I've always been on the side of women, of course, and supporting women in this fight. But if we want to be comprehensive, we also need to address violent men. And I visited a center in Arras, in the north of France, that managed to reduce by 60% the repeat offences by addressing these violent men, having them follow psychological support courses and educational courses to address their behavior. And the government's commitment is to create at least 2 such accommodation centres per region in France by the end of the president's term. The issue of violence against women should not be decorrelated from other gender issues. When a woman knows that when she goes back home, she'll be humiliated, ill-treated, battered in front of her children. Well, I think that it's probably quite difficult for that woman to think about how she's going to negotiate a pay rise or plan her career, and because she's in survival mode, and even if the violence she's escaped violence, she still has the scars of the violence that she experienced time and time again. And so if you've been insulted, belittled over and over again, you need support. And so this issue is intimately linked to greater equality in the workplace. And I think that once women are all fully financially autonomous, they will be in a better position to fight to end violence against women. And Emmanuel Macron, on the occasion of the G7, has committed to draft a new law on equality for women in the workplace. And in France, the pay gap can vary from 9 to 27%. And so that's an area where we need to make progress. And once we've gained ground there, we will have made quite a lot of progress. And as Simone de Beauvoir said, a woman should be able to fund her own needs and her children's need. That's the guarantee of her security. France will also encourage ratification by as many countries as possible of the Istanbul Convention. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of coordination and collaboration in Europe and beyond to support ratification of the Convention. All the provisions of the Istanbul Convention are accessible and can be implemented by all countries around the world. Often, Emmanuel Macron says when he's abroad, likes to say France is back, and I like to add, so is feminism. Today, feminism is gaining ground. There's also a strong backlash, but I think it's interesting that here at the OECD we have an opportunity, men and women together, all countries together, to join forces to end violence against women. Our motto is to be uncompromising, whether it be an offhand remark or the most violent forms of assault. Each and every one of those acts needs to be taken into account and addressed. And that's why, on behalf of France, I would like to thank you for your commitment, for your engagement in this battle. And we look forward to working with all of you at the Generation Equality Forum and on other occasions. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful conference. Thank you, Minister, for these very inspirational words. You underlined how important this conference is, and this is a great source of motivation to further our work on ending violence against women.
To introduce a very important speaker, Mrs. Charlotte Neer. Mrs. Neer is the CEO of Reigate and Banstead Women's Aid Refuge and serves as an ambassador for women's aid in the United Kingdom. A survivor of domestic abuse, she is now a tireless advocate for women facing violence, and we are very fortunate to have her with us today. Mrs. Neer.
Thank you very much for listening to me today. I'm a survivor of domestic abuse. I also run a refuge that helps women and children who are fleeing abuse to restart their lives. My refuge is renowned in the UK for the complete rehabilitation and support we provide women and children. We've worked hard over the 8 years I've been running it to understand every little thing we can do to help these families end the cycle of abuse, which echoes through the generations. Before I tell you more about that, I want to tell you my story. I hope it will give you insight into why we need to change our view of domestic abuse as an isolated event and see it for the stripping away of human rights that it is. My childhood was one of domestic abuse and coercive control. My mum had been married twice, both men abused her, and I was seriously impacted by the abuse perpetrated by my stepfather. He was the ultimate controller. I grew up thinking that he was hiding round corners, listening to what I was saying. He told me he'd bugged the telephone and that he knew everything I'd been talking about. I learned from a young age to try and judge his mood. Everyone thought he was absolutely charming, but the minute the front door closed on the outside world, we saw the monster. I was terrified of him, and that wasn't just the physical violence. It was the whole persona that he'd managed to create, like an omnipresent threat. A painful example of his controlling ways was when I was around age 8. He told my brother, who was 10, to help him sort something out in the loft. My brother asked him if he could use the toilet, and he refused to let him. I remember my brother coming down the ladder, covered in dust, with streaks down his legs, where he'd just had to wet himself. He often used the bathroom as a means of control, refusing to get out of the bath for hours when he knew we needed the toilet. I guess the humiliation pleased him. My mother was unable to stand up to him, and it took me a long time to understand why she hadn't protected us. It was only through my own experiences that I finally understood. I reflect on my childhood and think that it makes sense that I ended up in an abusive relationship. I'd learned that living in fear of an abusive man was normal, and the confusion and disabling effects created by coercive control strip you of the ability to see things clearly. I met my ex-husband in 1994, and I really want to emphasise how important it is to note how long this has gone on for, and still carries on today. Coercive control and domestic abuse affect your life, probably forever to some degree, unless you can get specialist support to unpick the damage. I was 24 years old and a single mum to a 6-month-old boy, Jake, my son. At that time, my brother had just been diagnosed with leukemia. I was in an exceptionally vulnerable place, and I was looking for somebody to support me through it. When I met my ex-husband, I heard that he had been violent in the past, but I chose to ignore that. And again, I wonder whether this was because it was so normalised for me. That must seem hard to understand from the outside, but my need for support and love was primary. He was absolutely dedicated, committed, and attentive towards me from the moment I met him. He wanted to share every waking moment with me, and it was a blissful relief to be sharing my life with someone who adored me. He shared in parenting Jake and wanted to take him on as his own. He loved Jake and he loved me, and warning me he was not what he seemed would have been fruitless. He moved into my flat immediately. He said right at the beginning of our relationship that he knew that couples who did things separately were probably cheating on each other, and that he knew we would never want to go out with each other without each other. He said he needed to make love every other day at least, otherwise he would feel that I didn't love him. The seeds were sown, and I accepted his views were right. I wanted to make him happy, and I was giving away my right to free choices without even knowing it. He told me about abuse he'd suffered in the past, and that he didn't have any confidence that he was lovable. He told me that he was terrified that I would leave him, and that his life would be meaningless without me. He told me he couldn't write properly because of his dyslexia. He begged me to help him deal with his paperwork. He threatened suicide within the first 3 months of our relationship. I felt he simply couldn't live his life without me in it. And in comparison to the other methods he used, this was one of the most powerful. He taught me that I alone was his reason for living. And so the next phase began. After about 9 months, we were at a wedding of one of his family members. He had been drinking all day and was beginning to get a bit angry with me. I told him that I was going to go home, and at that time I had no idea what would happen if I disobeyed him, but I learned very quickly. As I walked up the drive away from the wedding venue, I heard running footsteps behind me. The next thing I knew, he had punched me so hard in the back of the head that I rolled down the bank that ran off the drive. At the bottom, in the dark, lying in the grass, he climbed on top of me and hit me repeatedly. Suddenly, he was gone. I was in complete shock and confusion and tried to think about what had just happened and what I should do. I really didn't want to make a fuss, but I knew that I needed to get home. I found his parents and asked for a lift in their car. I tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't want to discuss it. We sat in silence all of the way home. I genuinely couldn't understand why they didn't seem shocked, but I learned that the family philosophy was just to pretend that it didn't happen. The next day, he appeared at my door. He was standing there crying when I opened it. He was so sorry for what he'd done. He said it was the alcohol, and of course he wouldn't hurt me. He loved me and couldn't live without me. Strangely, I felt sorry for him. Thoughts for myself and what I deserved just weren't even present. It was all about him and how sad he was and how he couldn't live without me. I invited him in, and I showed him in the most powerful way possible that I was prepared to accept his behaviour. Of course, I wanted to believe that it wouldn't happen again, and I convinced myself, but deep down I think I knew it would. After that incident, he was so much more loving and attentive for a period of time. In later years, he told me that he had a name for that period of making things right. He called it creep mode. My behaviour changed after the incident. I was always more careful about what I said and did and made sure that I didn't disobey him. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, except for my friend who'd been babysitting that night. I knew even then that telling anyone would result in them telling me to leave him, and I couldn't. I wanted to see if it could work, but I also knew that I was trapped. After about 6 months of becoming more and more compliant, there was a terrible night. He'd been drinking again, and we were in bed. He suddenly told me he was leaving me out of the blue with no warning. So I said that if he wanted to leave, he should go there and then. Well, that was a mistake. He knocked me down to the floor and straddled me. He was punching me repeatedly in the face, and every time he hit me, stars flashed in my eyes. He was repeating over and over again that he was going to kill me. And he then sunk his teeth into my neck. He was like a wild animal, and I truly thought I was going to die. The memory of knowing you're going to die never leaves you. He got up and dragged me to the kitchen by my hair. I was trying to find the light switch as he dragged me because I thought that maybe if he could see me, he'd wake up from this trance. He grabbed a carving knife and tried to stab me. I grabbed the end of the blade and it cut through my finger. I was screaming at him to please stop, to look at me. He suddenly stopped and I ran. I thank God that Jake wasn't there that night, as I wonder whether I'd have escaped if I had had to stop to pick him up. My neighbour took me in and called the police. Apparently he barricaded himself in and tried to hang himself from the loft hatch. But who knows if that was true, because suicide attempts were to become a regular feature of our lives together. And yes, I got back together with him. There were bail conditions set which he breached almost immediately. The crying and the begging and the creep mode followed, and I forgave him. He didn't give me any time to think, and by that time I was so confused it was the route of least resistance. My family must have wondered why I was going back to him, but I minimised everything. He persuaded me to drop the charges, and I did. I remember feeling so embarrassed in the face of the sheer frustration of the policeman as he pleaded with me not to drop it. My ex-husband was waiting in the car down the road for me, though, and I didn't have a choice, or at least that's how I felt. I became like his family. It became easier to pretend everything was normal. By this time, my fate was sealed. I couldn't leave. He would kill me. Until you face death, you will never know how powerful that threat is. He always used to say, "The only way I'll ever leave you is in a box," and I believed him. Over the years, many terrible things happened. He strangled me. He put a bag over my head. He hurt me when I was pregnant with both my girls. He raped me. Sex was part of his control. Him wanting sex every other day still existed, and I had to go along with it. I only said no once, and he still did it anyway, so what was the point? He hurt me in front of my children too. On Jake's first day of school, I was holding him in my arms in his lovely new uniform. I was pregnant with Daisy at the time. He pushed me with such force that I fell backwards onto the bed. And after that, I took Jake to school, and he had to deal with that on his first day. He was 4. He assaulted me in front of one of our daughters when she was 3. I remember her gripping my arm and saying, "Mummy, can we go out, please? Now, Mummy, please." And she remembers that too. I stayed in a refuge once. It was on my youngest daughter's first birthday. Sorry. There were no support staff, and it was an awful place, so I returned home the next day. That must seem strange, to prefer to go home to the abuse rather than stay in a refuge, but it isn't that simple. I was utterly helpless and weak and still terrified that he'd kill himself. It gave me the desire, though, in later years to work in a refuge, because I've so much respect for any woman that manages to start her life again in the face of so much opposition and fear. In the end, there was an incident that was the tipping point. He attempted to strangle me. Later that evening, he took a knife from the kitchen drawer. Danielle was 2 years old, and she was standing with me, holding onto my leg. I thought he would try and stab me again, but this time he wrapped my fingers over his hand on the handle and tried to make me stab him. He kept saying, "Kill me now," as he tried to get me to stab him. At that moment, I thought about it, and I actually considered it. I knew at that point that one of us was going to die, and I couldn't pretend anymore. It seemed strange that I accepted constant thoughts of him killing me, but the time that I considered killing him was the turning point. I went to see a solicitor. I had to borrow money from family, and I got a non-molestation order and an occupation order. He then sought contact with the children through the family court, and it was granted. This was in 2002, and for the next 8 years, he used his time with the children to control me. I couldn't start new relationships, as he'd threaten anyone I met. I'd be on permanent standby, waiting for him to call me with some abuse or threat about the children. He still came to the house frequently, and I often had to have sex with him or risk an escalation of his behaviour. I had to make sure that he stayed calm at all times, as he was having the children on his own, and I wasn't even there to protect them. Eventually, in 2010, I went to the police. I really wanted to help. I still couldn't see a way out, but I wanted to take a step in the right direction. I was seen by a very nice police officer. I could tell that he thought it was a bit of a waste of time, as there hadn't been any violence since 2002. However, he'd said he'd do a risk assessment, and that changed his perception. He wanted to know whether I would pursue criminal charges, but I said I wanted to think about it. Later they called me, and I said I still couldn't. I was too scared. I did say, though, that if anyone else ever came forward, I would stand with them. And sure enough, 6 weeks later, I got a call to say somebody else had come forward. It took 14 months for it to come to court. On the day, he pled guilty to everything except the rape, which was dropped but left on court files. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, plus 3 years extended probation. And if you ask me now, would I go through the criminal process again? I would say yes, but it wouldn't be that straightforward, and it never is for victims of coercive control. I know there are benefits to having had the convictions in the sense that my children were protected and I had 7 years of peace. However, his probation ended in 2018, and I was told that he was still a risk to me, so we had to move house. And that's the point I'm making. It's never over. I still lock all of my doors and jump when somebody knocks on my front door. Coercive control is a stripping away of human rights. I know this is true because years ago I printed out the Bill of Human Rights and stuck it on my fridge to remind myself that I was entitled to feel safe and to express an opinion. It's amazing to think that such basic rights were forgotten to me. What I wanted to illustrate with my story is how domestic abuse is unlike any other crime. It isn't an isolated incident like a mugging or a burglary. It can be a lifelong situation that you simply can't get over. This is why I believe we have to stop viewing it through a criminal justice lens. Currently in the UK, the focus is always a criminal justice-based approach, and there is a misconception that this solves the problem. Until we start looking at it differently, we are not going to change things. We have to see the criminal justice element as part of the solution, but not the whole answer. We have to view this as what it is, a human rights abuse where the victim is hostage to the perpetrator. Simply telling the victim she has to leave will never work. There has to be support in place which must be properly funded. An illustration of this is when I started working at the shelter I run for the women and children who are fleeing abuse, the number of women who returned to the abusive relationship was around 1 in 5. Over years of developing a whole system approach of therapeutic and practical interventions, we've got the number down to about 1 in 20 women returning to the perpetrator. If the focus remains on solely criminal justice, then this will fail, as victims will continue to not support prosecutions, as they know that it will only be a temporary interlude from the fear. I work with women every day who are paralysed by fear and who are lucky to escape with their lives. The courage it takes to even leave the relationship is something most people will never understand, and the threat of death is very real. To also ask somebody to support a prosecution which may not be successful is asking too much at a time when the perpetrator can find that victim. The only way that it can be successful is if there is intensive support and safeguarding measures that properly protect and help that woman to go through with it. Of course, if there are children involved, the related issues increase exponentially. Consider supporting a prosecution while a family court still expects you to facilitate contact between your children and the abuser. There is still a conflict between children's social care and the family courts. I work with women every day who have been told by children's services to leave their abuser because they are failing to protect their children, only to be told by the family court that they are vindictive for not letting their abuser see the children. There is so much to be gained by working with victims like me. I've been through it myself and have used my experience to develop a system that works to prevent re-victimisation, not just for the women, but for their children who may carry on the cycle as I did from my childhood. I would like you to take away this thought: work with survivors like me if you really want to make a difference. We are the only ones who really understand what needs to be done if you want to change the prevalence of violence against women. Thank you.
Mrs. Neer, thank you so very much for your powerful words. It's difficult but important for all of us to hear firsthand what it is like to experience and recover from domestic violence. And it's inspirational for us to know how you have turned this experience into something so valuable for other women in need. Thank you for all that you do and for sharing your story with us today. I would now like to introduce our opening high-level panel. This panel will be moderated by Mrs. Belinda Goldsmith, the editor-in-chief at Thomson Reuters Foundation. Mrs. Goldsmith, panelists.
Charlotte, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I think everyone in this room was emotionally moved from what a powerful story and hearing what so many women are going through. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Ministers, distinguished guests. Thank you for joining us for the opening of this high-level panel discussion on the need to end violence against women and girls. I'm very much looking forward to taking part in this conference, and which has already started off with very powerful statements and testimonies from our opening speakers. Thank you to the Secretary-General and to Madam Clear for your opening words and for the kind introductions. My name's Belinda Goldsmith. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And as many of you may already know, Thomson Reuters Foundation has already made quite a commitment to working against violence against women. We work on women's rights at the foundation, and that ranges from a dedicated news coverage and international polls on the challenges facing women, and to specialist journalism training and authoritative legal research triggering policy change on the ground. In 2018, for example, our global pro bono legal service, Trust Law, launched a women's rights working group and is holding workshops in Paris with the Kering Foundation, OECD, and Fondation des Femmes, which are looking at laws to tackle domestic violence and how you get effective legal protections for those at risk of domestic violence. I'm delighted to be here at the OECD to talk about how we can prevent and end the brutal violence that's carried out against women and girls every day around the world. Statistics tell us that 1 in 3 women globally will face violence, some sort of violence, during their lifetime. And that is very likely a low estimate. As we know, many women, and we've heard many women, are resistant and hesitant to come forward, and with good reason. Many fear retaliation from their partners. Many are not economically independent for the men who are injuring them. And many fear that the police and justice system will not fully support them if they do come forward. Some figures from the Women's Aid in the UK last year show that 45% of people who do flee from their domestic abuse end up sofa surfing, and 12% end up sleeping rough. We face what is truly a global epidemic of violence, and it has wide-ranging social, public health, and human rights costs. Over the next 2 days, we'll be talking about the things that governments and relevant stakeholders can do to better address this important issue. Looking at the agenda, I think we will all come out of this conference with a lot of knowledge and hope that we will all feel empowered to drive change and end violence against women. In the opening panel, we're going to try to understand the landscape of intimate partner violence against women across OECD countries. We have a fascinating panel with high-level representatives from government, the non-profit sector, and the private sector to share their perspectives with us. Let me now introduce our panelists. You can find more detailed information on the panelists in the Who's Who booklet that you've all received. But I will start by mentioning someone who couldn't be with us today, Minister Lee from Korea. She unfortunately had to cancel her trip because of the coronavirus outbreak. But she has sent us a video, which we are going to show now.
This is Jang Lee, Minister of Gender Equality and Family of the Republic of Korea. It is a great honor to share Republic of Korea government position in this meaningful occasion. I would like to share our challenges and accomplishments. I really want to have a mutual learning through face-to-face communication. However, thanks to technological devices, our dialogue may not be fully interrupted. IPV can be categorized into 2 sectors, such as domestic violence and dating and stalking violence. In Korea, public awareness on domestic violence has improved. For example, Act on Prevention of Domestic Violence and Protection of Victims has been legislated in 1997, and the support system has been established accordingly. In addition, counseling, protection, legal and medical assistance are provided via Women's Emergency Hotline Centers, the Domestic Violence Counseling Centers, and 207 shelters for victims of domestic violence, where professional training and subsidies are provided for the victims' economic independence. However, other types of IPV, such as dating violence and stalking, need more intervention and relevant legislation. It is one of the biggest challenges the Korean government is facing to raise public awareness on these issues and expand the support for the victims of violence of dating and stalking. Korean government has extended the umbrella for the victims of sexual violence in general. The Ministry of Gender Equality and Family has been focusing on supporting for the victims of sexual violence at 39 total service centers called Sunflower Centers. These Sunflower Centers are hosted by 39 general hospitals which provide one-stop 24 hours, 7 days services ranging from counseling, medical assistance, and investigation support to legal assistance. And recently, the ministry required investigative agencies to provide their staff members with an education program designed to prevent secondary victimization, a move to protect the victims who took courage to speak from additional damage. The ministry is actively responding against illegal photography and dissemination between private partners through a cross-ministerial support system. In 2017, the comprehensive measures against digital sex crimes was devised through pan-governmental efforts, and digital sex crime prevention teams were installed within related agencies, solidifying the victim support system. To devise a system to prevent violence against women, including IPV, the Violence Against Women Act has been put in place, laying the foundation for prevention policies against gender-based violence, including stalking, dating violence, leaving no legal blind spot. In addition, the first midterm plan for 2020 to 2024 was established, and its implementation will be monitored by the Violence Against Women Prevention Committee periodically. The Korean government will work closely with not only Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, but also related agencies to ensure this problem can be solved at both individual and social structural levels. And through committees such as Gender Equality Committee, which is chaired by the Prime Minister, all ministries will organically work for punishment, prevention, and support. Going forward, the ministry will work closely with relevant agencies and international organizations for swift and strong responses to promptly support victims with proper services and prevent all forms of violence, especially between intimate partners. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you to the Korean ambassador and delegates here for helping us to share that message. Now for the panelists on stage. Remy Boyer, next to me, is the Chief of Human Resources and CSR at the Korean Group. He spent 12 years in ArcelorMittal Group, where he was General Secretary, Operational HR Director and CSR, followed by various high-level roles at the PSA car-making group. Mr. Boyer is representing the Korean Group, which, with 82% of women in its staff, supports the 1 in 3 initiative, along with a group of French companies committed to ending violence against women. Ms. Hilary Pennington is an Executive Vice President at the Ford Foundation, where she oversees Ford's programs globally, the Foundation's Build program, and the Office of Strategy and Learning. Before becoming the Executive Vice President, she served as the Foundation's Vice President for Education, Creativity and Free Expression. Prior to joining Ford, Ms. Pennington was an independent consultant whose clients included the Next American University project of the New America Foundation and Arizona State University. She also led the Generations Initiative, a project to develop effective responses to dramatic demographic shifts in the United States. Ms. Gabriela Ramos is the OECD Chief of Staff and OECD Sherpa to the G20. She's responsible for the OECD's contributions to the global agenda through its engagements in the G20, G7 and APEC, and she oversees the OECD's Global Relations Secretariat. She leads the OECD's Inclusive Growth and Gender Initiatives, and she promoted the G20 Climate and Growth Analysis and the G7 Business for Inclusive Growth Initiative. She also helped create the W20. Previously, she was head of the OECD office in Mexico and Latin America. She was decorated with the Ordre du Mérite by the President of France, François Hollande, in 2013. Her work to promote gender equality earned her the 2017 and 2018 Forbes Excellence Award, as well as being included twice as part of Apolitico's 100 Most Influential People on Gender. State Secretary Julienne Zivert is the permanent State Secretary in the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth in Germany. Previously, she was the Federal Managing Director of the Social Democratic Party. From 2013 to 2016, she worked in the State Chancellery of the State of Rhineland-Palatinate, and prior to that, she served in several federal ministries. And finally, we have State Secretary Karin Strandås, who is the State Secretary to the Minister for Gender Equality in Sweden, within the Swedish Ministry of Employment. Ms. Strandås has extensive experience in Swedish politics, having served as the State Secretary to the Minister for Culture and Democracy and head of the Green Party Parliamentary Office. She has a long-term commitment to human rights issues and has a history within civil society organisations such as ActionAid and the Swedish Burma Committee. It's a really impressive group of panellists we've got here, and we're very fortunate to have them all on stage at the same time to discuss intimate partner violence. As you may have noticed, something curious is going on here. All but one of the panellists are women. Despite serious negotiations and even pleased to have male ministers represented on this stage throughout the conference, we were only able to secure one current male minister to come to speak at this event. Over lunch, I was also sharing with some of the panellists that I was in Davos a couple of weeks ago, where there was a panel on gender parity, 50-50 parity, where the Finnish Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, the 34-year-old youngest Prime Minister in the world, was speaking on the panel. Sadly, the room was only just more than half full. And this is what the World Economic Forum, where gender equality is meant to be a major priority. Right, so during our discussions today and tomorrow, I think a crucial question will be to consider how we get men on board with this issue. Not just at home and in society at large, but especially in government and in other crucial positions of power. This matters because as long as women remain the only public officials willing to talk about the topic, there is a real risk that intimate partner violence will continue to be seen as a women's issue. With that said, let's begin the conversation. If I can start down the end, Ms. Strandås, you live in a country that most people think of as being a pioneer on gender equality. We know Sweden's got one of the highest female employment rates in the world and more women in parliament than most countries. But despite this rosy outlook, violence against women, particularly intimate partner violence, is of grave concern to you. Can you tell us about the nature of this problem in Sweden? And what are the major challenges you're facing on the ground? And what challenges do you face prioritising this issue in government?
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for having me and organising this very important event. I'm really pleased to be here. Well, it is true that intimate partner violence and violence against women is a grave concern and something that we take very seriously from our government. I don't think this is because the problem is bigger in Sweden than elsewhere, but it's because that we are a feminist government and we have a zero tolerance on violence against women. We don't accept it. But it's still there, and that's why we have to keep focusing on it and develop our policies to make progress on this issue. When it comes to the nature of the problem in Sweden, I can say that there has been a long-term decrease in deadly partner violence against women in our country. And I think it's likely that one of the explanations for this is the increasing economic independence for women. It is easier for women to break up and leave a dangerous relationship now than it was 30 years ago. In the 70s, we started to make important reforms in order to get women to participate in the labor market to a higher degree than was before, such as individual taxation and public high-quality childcare, and those types of reforms that made it possible for women to enter the labor market. And I think that that's really important because to be dependent financially is actually a high risk for women, and it makes it harder to leave a relationship where there's violence. There has been an increase in the reports of sexual violence and offences against women in recent years in Sweden. And I think we need to work to get these numbers up and to get them down, because we know that the hidden figures are big in Sweden and elsewhere. We know that violence exists. So we need numbers to reflect reality, and that needs work. But there is an increased willingness to report these crimes, and I think this is very positive. And I think that the Me Too movement has had a huge positive impact in this respect, that more crimes are being reported. And I find it so utterly upsetting that throughout history, women are the ones, victims of violence are the ones who have been blamed and shamed for something that someone else has done. And I think what we're beginning to see with the Me Too movement is that this shame is taken away from the victim and it's put where it should be, and that is with the offender. And I think that's hugely important. So at the same time as we still need to do this awareness raising and trying to get the numbers up, of course we need to get the real numbers down. We have to create effective measures and implement them in order to actually fight the violence. And it's still estimated that only around 20% of the offences are actually being reported in Sweden. And when it comes to convictions, the numbers are even worse. About 5 out of 100 cases reported to the police are results in a conviction. So moving on to, you were asking about challenges. That is definitely one challenge that we face, even though we are working a lot with educating the police and prosecutor and so on. Another challenge that I would like to mention is that we need to become better at discovering violence. We know that a lot of women who are abused and suffer from violence are in contact with public agencies in some way. It can be the agency for labor or social services, but perhaps they don't speak about their violence. So we're working a lot with government agencies on how they can develop measures and also educate their staff who meet a lot of people, to ask questions about violence, so that we become better at discovering this and be able to help them. I also want to highlight one issue which is of a major concern to us, and that is migrant women who might often be in a more vulnerable position, as it is in Sweden. And I think it's quite common that migrant women participate in the labor market to a lower degree than nationally born, and that of course impacts their economic independence, and sometimes also have weaker social networks. So that is something that we have to work on, both when it comes to women who are in Sweden without maybe the proper permits, but also when it comes to women who have asylum and have the right to stay in Sweden. When it comes to, you were also asking about challenges prioritizing. Well, maybe one more issue is prevention, which I think we have to talk about. And I was really happy to see that there are panels that will talk about toxic masculinity and so on. Because we have to focus on protecting the women and helping them and supporting them, but we also have to attack the root causes, and that is that we have to have, we need to prevent men from using violence. And we need to develop, and I think there's a need to develop more effective methods there that we should work on together. But when it comes to challenges to prioritize the issue in government, I would say that I'm happy to say that we don't have any challenges with prioritizing the issue in our government. We are a feminist government, and I'm happy to say that our male ministers are also devoted feminists. But the issue or the challenge is how. Even though we've done some good things, we're still so far away from having solved the problem. So there's still a lot to be done, and that's the real challenge, I would say. Thank you.
You mentioned that the number of reports coming in has gone up. Has there been some sort of public campaigning around that?
There has been the Me Too campaign. So as a government, I don't think we can take much credit for that. Of course, we've been working on that too, but I would probably say that it's the work of the women's rights movement and girls and women who have done this, spoken out and created this wonderful movement.
Many thanks. Ms. Seifert, we know that intimate partner violence is a problem in Germany as well. What kind of challenges do you see and hear about from women in Germany? And what obstacles are you facing in ensuring this issue is mainstreamed and prioritised across institutions of government?
Thanks a lot. First of all, I want to thank the OECD as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is putting the topic on the agenda and is holding an international conference, which is really helpful in my opinion. Thank you for this. In my ministry in Germany, when we talk about gender equality, we have a headline. And the headline says, women can make it all. And it means that women can become president, CEO, doctor, justice, whatever. But we know in the same time that women can make it all is a statement, but is even a postulation. Because we have many conditions in our societies that prohibit that women can make it all. And when we have a look to violence against women, we see even in Germany that every third woman is affected by violence once in their lifetime. We see that every third day a woman is killed in Germany by her partner or ex-partner. And we know that our colleague, our cousin, our neighbor, our close friend can be victim of violence. So, and as far as we know this, and as long this is reality in Germany and even in many other states, we even know that the saying women can make it all can't be reality. So we really have to work on it. We have to put it on the top of the agenda to make it become reality. But we even say women can make it all in the context of violence, and sometimes people look at us and say, how can you say this? But we have the strong persuasion that women can make it all, even in the terms of escaping from violence, in the moment they have the support they need and they have the infrastructure they need, and that's our belief and in the idea how we act and how we work on the topic. In Germany, the whole topic of violence against women is a strong chapter and a strong part of the coalition agreement the parties of the government signed. And we are working on it with a lot of power since about 2 years. We established a round table of all levels of governments, like the federal government, the states, and even the local authorities, to work together and to improve the infrastructure we have. What we actually see and what we focus on, mainly two pillars, maybe. First, terms of infrastructure, we see that mainly in rural areas, women have difficulties to find places in women's shelter. We see that disabled women with many children and sons and a migrant background have difficulties to find places. And therefore, we started a founding program in the government with 120 million euro from 2020 to 2023 to support the states to improve the infrastructure we have. And second, we want to raise awareness to talk about the topic, that women feel encouraged to talk about it, or not to feel ashamed, as you said it. And we even want to raise awareness that the people around who see that their colleagues, neighbors, friends are affected, break their silence and talk about it, because we see that it's not a topic where people want to talk about publicly. Once in a year, at the end of November, when there's the International Day of Violence, the official numbers are published, and the whole society and medias are shocked for 2 days. And often they stop talking about it for 363 days after. And we want to change this. We want to raise awareness how important the topic is. And we even want to, as you said, and I think that's important, even want to focus on men. Because it can't actually be that if a woman is affected, she has to move out, she has to leave her home, and her husband can stay without any problem. And actually, it's him who has to leave, and we even see that men have more problems, like they have higher rates of suicides, they have higher rates of for them it's more difficult to talk to somebody else or to get support or to get some help if they are in a bad situation. And we even want to focus on them and want to have a look how can we improve and how can we help them maybe to get out of a situation, avoid some situations. And in November we started a national campaign as a ministry, first of all to raise awareness, but the campaign even bundled many organizations and initiatives in Germany that give support and concrete support to the women in Germany. So they can look it up in the internet and they can see if there's an initiative close by to get help.
You mentioned it's not really a topic for public discussion apart from 2 days of the year in Germany. Has Me Too helped that at all, as it has in Sweden? Has it brought more people forward to talk about it?
Yeah, but yes and no, because there was a huge debate about Me Too, but it's the hard topic of violence is in a way excluded, or is too often excluded.
Thank you. Ms. Ramos, you come at this from an intergovernmental perspective. Here at the OECD, you can take a bird's eye view of what's going on in different countries in terms of intimate partner violence. So what is going on across countries? And what do you see as the main challenges? And why is the OECD prioritising the issue of intimate partner violence?
I think that's a great question, and also it's great that we have this conference. Actually, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank all of the members of the Secretariat that have been working for this topic for so long. Because it's true that if you think in the OECD, it's like Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. What do you have to do with women's violence or societal violence? And the fact is that we started working on women's economic empowerment, and then we moved to women governance representation, and what we have the CG, which is gathering all the cultural indicators, and then we have how much we will win if the talent of women is used, and then you just confronted with this awful reality that the worst manifestation of what is wrong in our societies and how societies treat women is that we are facing this huge violence. I mean, just think about it, because we repeat the numbers and then we just repeat the numbers. 1 out of 3. 1 out of 3 in countries that are already advanced. That we are talking about people that are educated. We cannot blame it on the lack of education. We cannot blame it on stress situations. It's not. It's 1 out of 3. According to the numbers that were provided for the conference, 38% of the causes of women is interpartner violence. 38%. You see these numbers kind of shocking, but then you normalize them. Oh yeah, 38%. My God, it's more important than cancer. It's more important that you crossing the street and having car accidents. So I think the magnitude of this problem brought all of us together. and brought all of us together because, as you have seen it, this is not the question of how do we help women getting out of it. That's, of course, the most important thing, and I commend the efforts of these countries and the Minister of France in terms of how you make sure that a crime get punished. Seems obvious, but how you ensure that the crime gets punished? How do you ensure that a crime gets punished when it's justified? When, again, 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 3 men justified violence. In these countries, of course, if you go to Afghanistan, 90% of women justified that they are beaten up. So that's normal. What was shocking about Charlotte's expression is that it's not even about bringing boys with us. It's how are we educating boys? We are moms, all. And I don't have boys, but excuse me, I have 2 girls only. But the fact is that this question of masculinities, the question of why men harm, why do they harm? What is wrong in our society is not about men or women, in our society that we create this behavior. And then, of course, once it happened, because it happens, why is our system so ineffective in dealing with it? Why do you, I mean, if you yourself have had any tragedy in your life, I have a big tragedy, one. I don't want to talk about it. It takes time for you to start talking about the tragedy when you lose somebody. And then you go with these systems that make the woman repeat and repeat, as Charlotte told us, repeat and repeat and repeat. I mean, it's just, and criminalize it in a way that is police-based, enforcement-based, law-based, instead of looking at the psychological thing first to help them. And at the OECD, we have been trying to develop these people-centered kind of policies. But the truth is that the témoignage, the witness that we have here is telling us exactly how you should deal with it. You should just first protect, you should just help psychologically, then you just need to pursue the crime. There are then loopholes in the law, and you find loopholes. And Nadine is here, she will confirm with me. We have this fantastic, terrible case in Mexico of a very rich man that killed his wife. He was in jail, convicted, because he was accused of homicide or murder attempt. But somebody in the legalities found that if he classified that exact crime as committed at home, he was out of jail. And he killed the wife. So you see, it's always with all these loopholes, and this is what we want to do. We want to take a whole of the government approach to see how can we start with education, go for the systems, the service systems that have to do with health, that has to do with the shelters, that have to do with the justice system, access to justice, training for justice, eliminating the bias that are in our societies, eliminating it from the institutions that are dealing with this. Again, Charlotte, and we know that the police officer saying, go home, it's your husband, come on guys, don't. And then if you think about it, we're hearing here about a woman, an adult that is being beaten. What about the girls that are abused by their dads? I mean, this is just unacceptable. Or something that we also take for granted, how many women have been abandoned while they're pregnant. And nobody knows who's the father, there's no responsibility. This is also so violent, and we don't deal with it. So I think these are the issues that we are looking at and that we're trying to see how can the OECD support. Of course, there are conventions. We have the Istanbul Convention, we have the United Nations Convention, bravo. Only 70% of the countries have ratified it, and I would say let's just ratify it. Second, the kind of sanctions that we have in the judicial system need to be improved. That is something that we can take a look in our governance director. We can take a look in the access to justice program. How do we make sure that these crimes receive proportionate sanctions? And then that you really get to the sanction. There's no more better deterrent than getting into the sanction. But the other part is what the ministers were saying, the fact that this goes unreported. How are we going to understand better if it goes unreported? And then if you think about it, you say, okay, well, I have been subject to violence or not. There was a big survey in Mexico that I was asked to share with all of my friends, and I did it myself. And I was responding, and then I'm like, oh my God. I have been victim. Not like massive, but you're like, wow, no, I answered yes to that question. I answered yes to this question. Not now, when I was younger. So it's a long-standing issue that we need to be documenting better, getting the definitions the same. I think this is also a question of how do we define the problem and how do we define it internationally. I think the conventions help in that sense, but it's not percolating in the way we are dealing with it in our governance systems. This is very important. And it's not percolating also in the kind of, once you have the legal infrastructure, once you have the real tools at place to help the victim, but also to avoid this from happening again, the fact is that how do you ensure that the whole thing works in a coherent fashion? Because this is also something that the Minister of France mentioned, that we have all compartmentalized, and then you need to be going from one to another service, and this is really not again. And then the fact is that women then face this double penalty because they don't trust their partners, but they don't trust the system. And therefore, who do they trust? That's what we really want to do. We want to improve the quality of data. We want to see how we can connect and learn from the countries that have been successful at bringing an integrated service provision for these issues. But I would say, how do we change the way we educate our child, men and women? Because women are the ones that educate boys. So how do we change that? And I have to say that the Education Directorate here in the OECD has a wonderful framework that is the global competencies that has to do on bringing back values, bringing back perspective, tolerance, understanding, and all these non-cognitive skills that are not so valued in general because you need to be strong in maths and that's fine. But all these non-cognitive skills, I think we need to put them back in the curricula to make sure that we succeed.
Thank you very much. Ms. Pennington, you're here today representing the Ford Foundation, which has developed a range of programmes addressing violence against women around the world, particularly in the Global South. Could you tell us why violence against women has become so important for foundations like yours, and how are you trying to address intimate partner violence through your programmes?
Yes, thank you. And I'm so excited also and grateful to be here and to learn with and from all of you over these next days. So the Ford Foundation is 80 years old. Several years ago, our board made the decision that we should focus on one thing only, and that is the rise in inequality that is happening all around the globe and causing the kind of political, economic, social upheaval that many, many of our countries are experiencing. And that led us to say one of the three issues that we work on internationally has to be the issue of violence against women and girls, because until women and girls are respected and free from fear, there cannot be equality. So we see them as two sides of the same coin. And this is, of course, as all my colleagues have been saying, a ubiquitous and very challenging problem. We are working on it in three ways. The first is to really try to fund practice, evidence, research on effective responses that work. And this means not only focusing on the need for holistic response, but also on prevention. And I think, as you said, Gabriela, it is the cultural norms that normalize violence that have to begin to be changed. So that's a central focus of our work. The second is to put the women who are most affected at the center of our strategy, and to try as much as we can to bring them into venues like this, to lift up their voices and to make sure that as policies are developed, they are at the center of those policies. And that's important not only for women in general, but when you think about all the other kind of intersecting identities that many women have that compound what they experience, identities of race and class and gender and ethnicity and LGBTQ or trans women. So women in general face these problems, and there are many women who face them and are marginalized and persecuted in very much worse kinds of ways. So we feel that when you look at a lot of what's happened over the last 25 years, there has in fact been progress. You can listen to this and feel this is a problem that is as old as human history. It can feel kind of depressing and kind of entrenched. And yet we know so much more than we did 25 years ago, and we are doing so much more. It is really important that this is recognized as a human right. It is really important that we have laws. It is really important that we're beginning to enforce those laws. And then that we are learning what kind of diagnoses, risk assessments, holistic services can help protect women and can help prevent violence before it starts. So all of that is progress, but it is really essential to have women at the center, because otherwise you face the kinds of things that you've been talking about. You know, for not every woman wants to get into the criminal justice system. Not every woman wants to start a cycle where her partner is criminalized. So we have a lot to learn from women themselves, and that's part of our focus. And then the last is to really, from our perspective, drive resources to the global south. If you look at this issue, it happens everywhere in the world. If you look at where the funding for it goes to the global north. And even for those institutions who work in global south countries, the majority of money goes to INGOs in the global north. So we feel that this cannot be a problem that is solved unless resources go to where they will be most effective, and that's much more to the global south, much more to women-led, girl-led, feminist-led kinds of movement organizations that tend to be very small and very under-resourced. And I think, you know, you mentioned the Me Too movement, and I just want to say, how many of you have seen the anthem, the feminist anthem that started in Chile, that young women have been singing and dancing all over the world? You know, that is a disruptive energy, and they are not going to wait for us. They're not going to wait for us. So those of us who want to be allies for that kind of movement have to figure out how we change fast enough and how we work together with them, because they've had enough, and they are having, I think, not everywhere, but increasingly impact politically. You know, it was the women's movements demonstrating in Sudan that helped bring down that government. Women demonstrating in South Africa who brought about, with the hashtag total shutdown, that caused Cyril Ramaphosa to put together a high-level commission on harassment and violence. So I think there's an enormously positive energy out in the world, but we as an institution, our institution, and I imagine it may be even harder for governments, have to figure out how do we relate to that. These are quick, viral, movement-led kinds of organizations. Oftentimes, they are not even an organization that you can figure out how to give money to. And oftentimes, these women-led movements don't want to become formal kinds of organizations because they have feminist principles that prevent them from that. So for us as an institution, we are finding ourselves to be disrupted in the most powerful and beneficial ways as we figure out how we can be better partners in this time.
But you mentioned, of course, all the projects you're doing in the Global South, being very much grassroots and women-led. Could you give an example of one of the projects you've been working with and one of the women you might have been working with?
Well, we've two I will describe. One is a group called Sonke Gender Justice, which is in South Africa. It focuses on women and men together, primarily as couples. And it does a lot of work to help them think about their relationships. So their economic futures, their planning to have children, but then also how they treat each other as respectful kinds of partners. Another project we've worked on, we were talking a little bit about this at lunch, you know, in many parts of the world where we work, this whole agenda, and women's rights in particular, are being characterized as an imposition from the West, as values that are foreign to the societies that we work in. And we are working really hard to find allies in each country where we work who know that that's not true. So one of our grantees is the queen of the Buganda people in Uganda, which is one of the largest ethnic groups there. And she has begun a very effective series of education programs to say, treating women and children with respect is an African tradition. That is who we are. That's always been part of our culture. So we're trying to find and lift up voices and examples like that, as well as strong protest kinds of movements, in the hope that, you know, with the recognition that it takes it all, but we cannot allow the cultural backlash and that narrative to win, because it's wrong.
Thank you. There's two great examples. Thank you very much. Mr. Boyer, you're the head of HR at Korean, a company that provides long-term care here in France and elsewhere in Europe. And of course, the vast majority of your residents and patients are women. Looking specifically at the sector, can you tell us about some of the challenges that you see among your clients and your staff? I believe 82% of your staff are women who've experienced domestic violence. Is it an issue you see frequently? And taking a broader view, given Koreans' view in the 1 in 3 network, why is the private sector getting more and more involved in the issue of violence against women, and what motivates the private sector to do so?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased and very honored to be here at this roundtable, and I like very much the Better Policies for Better Lives, which is an OECD commitment, which is also the private sector commitment. Yeah, I'm supposed to represent the private sector, but I'm more here as a practitioner, I would say, in human resources policies and corporate social responsibility policies. I'm also the only man, you mentioned it at the beginning on this round table, but I'm also representing a woman, which is my boss, who is one of the rare chief executive officers in France of listed companies. We have only 9 women out of the SBF 120 listed company in France. And if you look at the so-called CAC 40, CAC 40 companies, it's even less. I will not mention the number. So when we discussed with Sophie Bossard, my boss, around this round table, she was invited here and she could not come. And she told me, you will go, because it's also a matter of women and men. And it was mentioned before. So I'm very happy to be here also for this reason. So moving at Korian, Korian is not a country. Sometimes people say Korea, no, it's Korian. Korian is a European group specialized in nursing homes, clinics, healthcare, and accompaniment to the more vulnerable and fragile people in the society. We are present in 6 countries in Europe, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And we have something like 900 sites across Europe. So indeed, it's a female company. You mentioned it, 82% of women, which means 46,200 women, 46,200,000 women across Europe. So it's definitely a woman company. But if you look at figures, always interesting to dig in. We are 25% of women in the executive committee. We are 48% of women across the top 100 executives, and 82% as a workforce. So you can make the calculation. So I think this is very important to start by that. And when we start to think about the violence against women, we thought we were statistically good, in a way, because of the importance of women. And then we start to think, like you said before, Mrs. Ramos, how can we measure it? How can we get figures? Or, you know, in the private sector, we usually say, what you cannot measure, you cannot manage. So if you want to measure, if you want to manage, you need to get data. And then we said how to get data on this very specific case of violence against women, and especially home violence, because you have also at the workplace some violence. So that's why we joined this initiative from some French companies, 6 big companies in France, like SNCF, Kering, L'Oréal, WeCare, and some others. And we said that together with private companies who are confronted to the same situation, especially L'Oréal, because of the share of women, we were probably more pertinent to get accurate figures. And that's why we joined this 1 in 3 women initiative of private companies. Korian went in that through the French foundation Agir contre l'exclusion, so Act Against Exclusion. And we joined this initiative almost 2 years ago to be part of a collective body to better understand what is at stake. And one of the first initiatives we took is to make a study, I think which will be presented tomorrow maybe, because I see Mrs. Pillinger in front of me. And we were part of these big studies which was done with 40,000 women across Europe. Not the 40,000 of Korian, of course, but 40,000 of the entire study. And this was a very interesting study, which shows very strong figures of violence against women. 1 in 3, 20% in this study, but we know that it's underestimated. And based on that, we had very interesting figures to start understanding what is at stake in the private sector. And if you move forward, there are at least 3 reasons why we can continue and we can better understand what is behind figures. The first reason is definitely, I would say, a business case. And I'm here also to represent the private sector. And what is this business case? Is with so many women every day in our nursing homes, clinics, hospitals, you have a direct link and impact of violence at home and absenteeism, or turnover, or I would say downgraded performance, or presence towards our patients and residents. So it's, you know, if you look at it only on the business side, it's something you have to do. The second reason why we had to join this initiative is definitely the, I would say, CSR approach. This is our responsibility, this is our duty to take care of the women who take care of others every day. And this is something very strong, because we say so very often at Korian that our role in HR is to take care of those who take care. It's a kind of symmetry of attention, because with these women, you know, who are coming from different origins, at Korian we have more than 120 nationalities represented in the women. So these women who every day, every night, every single day of the year do provide care for others, what shall we do ourselves as HR, of course, but as a company, to take care of these women? So that's why the study of better understanding where the violence is coming from, where it is exercised, and how we can manage this is so important. And the last and the third reason was more an ethical one, because our job is definitely to deal and to manage vulnerability, fragility, and especially at a very special time, which is the end of life. So we worked a lot with our foundation. We have a foundation at Korian, which is named the Foundation for Aging Well. And we started to discuss with the foundation, and we have made of the women cause one of the big axes, one of the three axes of our foundation. Not only because we have a lot of women, but because what we do as a profession is very much regarding how to manage vulnerability, fragility, old age. So these are the three reasons why we have joined this initiative. We are only at the beginning. These 6 companies signed this agreement end of 2018. So we are ourselves at the beginning of a journey. We have to learn more. We have to go more in the statistics, in the programs. There are some initiatives which are ongoing. The first is a communication campaign to start with e-learning on what is violence against women, how we can detect it, what we can do with that. So this e-learning will be widespread in the company this year. And the second initiative is to, I will come back to that later, but to work on the management. Because, you know, with such a fragmented company with a lot of sites across Europe, all is about proximity and understanding what is at stake in the sites, not in Paris headquarters.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the study that's coming out on Friday, did you say?
No, I was mentioning the study from 1 in 3 million, this collective body, and okay. Mrs. Pillinger is here. She will speak tomorrow, and there are a lot of interesting statistics in the study. I cannot detail everything, but you see that the impact, the very important impact of violence at home on the professional life. For instance, constant harassment, text message on the smartphones, neighboring, indirect violence, influence of the colleagues. All these statistics are very important because they are very high. And most of the time it's 55%, 87% of women who continue to be a victim inside the professional environment. And it's our duty, but also it's our responsibility to be aware of that and to train our management to detect that and to treat it, to act on that.
Great, I look forward to hearing more about that study tomorrow. Thank you. So thank you all very much for the fascinating overview of the challenges that we're addressing and the unique challenges in different countries as well. Perhaps we can now turn to look at how policymakers and other relevant stakeholders can do a better job of prioritising intimate partner violence in their programming and policy making. How can we ensure that government ministries, service providers, non-profits and the private sector develop a better capacity to prevent, mitigate and ultimately end violence against women? A little reminder for people watching, you can watch online. We are accepting questions as well via Twitter, and the hashtag for today is hashtag #EdViolence Against Women and @OECD_social. So if we can go down to the end for Ms. Strand-Source, you said, of course, that the ministries in the government in Sweden does treat it as a priority. Are there other areas in Sweden where there is a struggle to get people on board, to get them to take this issue seriously?
Well, of course, I would say that, I mean, we're part of the global community, and it's challenging times. So in that sense, we have polarization growing also in the political debate in Sweden, and as well as right-wing extremism. So I think what I would say is that nothing has ever happened by itself when it comes to progress on gender equality. Every single step forward has always been a struggle. But still saying that, I still feel that we are now living in times where maybe we've sort of seen that it's going to be progress. It's just a matter of how hard we work and how long it takes. But now we also have to sort of play defense and to also really work on protecting the progress that we've made. And we haven't been forced to focus on that before. So in that sense, we can see the challenge coming, right, so to speak.
Thank you. Ms. Seifert, Germany is going to soon assume the EU presidency. Are there any plans to target intimate partner violence at the EU level? And what are the goals for the presidency on that issue?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, Germany is taking the EU presidency starting in beginning of July for half a year. And we will put gender equality as a main topic on the agenda. And within this topic, violence against women is even a really central and crucial topic for us. And next November, we will invite all ministers of gender equality in Europe to come to Potsdam to have an international European conference on gender equality and even talk about violence against women. And the 2 days before, we will invite for a high-level conference even to Potsdam to discuss only about violence against women. And we are planning, first of all, yes, to put it on the agenda that the member states have the possibilities to discuss the challenges they are facing in their states and to discuss what they are doing, what is useful, where they can learn from member states. And of course, it would be wonderful when the member states agree that we have to work on a European level on it and strengthen the European politics in Brussels, even to improve the progresses we are doing on this topic. What we really would like to discuss and to present in a way on the European level. In Germany, we have since 7 years a hotline, national-wide hotline. It's free of charge. It's 24 hours a day opened, and every woman can call. And what we see is that more than 200,000 women called the hotline. And 1.5 years ago, I went to the offices where the 80 people work and just talk to them, and it was really shocking what one can hear. And they get calls in situations where the women are locked in bathrooms and say, how should I get out, what should I do? And they can get concrete help. And the hotline has a European-wide number, so it would be possible to think about how, for example, one can improve it to a European hotline. And even now in Germany, we offer 18 languages, so every member state could even think if it even implements such a hotline to give concrete help to the women in Europe.
Thank you. Ms. Ramos, we've heard that OECD research showing that OECD ministers are increasingly prioritising this issue. But how can the OECD help governments build capacity to fight back against intimate partner violence? And what can intergovernment organisations like the OECD do to foster change?
You say that our members are prioritising. I hope so, because the fact is that when you get into competing agendas, then you need to see where, and I see one ambassador. There are many ambassadors that are very supportive for this agenda, and I hope that in the upcoming priorities that are going to be settled by members, and that then you have many competings because we're multidisciplinary, that they put gender I know that many will put gender, but that they also put violence against women as one of the priorities and a foundational issue to build a much better economy and society. And that's how we want to frame it. I think that you are completely right. The question of how an organization like us can present the evidence and working, of course, with Ford. We have been working with Ford on projecting not only why is wrong from the human rights perspective, but also how it is wrong and is harming the economies, the societies, and the evolution of our own country. So we need to continue the awareness. This conference is part of the OECD saying we're there, we're there, and we care, and we want to do more research. This is very important. We are launching a call to action, and tomorrow we will get back on that for you. So at least we can say, we care. This is something that it should not be happening. Then what do? We want to work with governments to identify the data gaps. Where governments that are well advanced in this, and I agree with Hillary, I think that governments have a lot to show of things that are working, but we also need to sit together to see where are the data gaps, where can we need to really improve the data gathering, because if something is done at the OECD, it's really to get the information standardized, high quality, that can really then lead to explain why some policies work and why some other policies don't work. Because this is the next step of what we do at the OECD. We try to identify the best practices, almost bottle, if we have the Sweden-German experience and some other experience around, we almost see what are the elements, what are the features, how can we translate that into common learning, and then to produce the benchmarks. Benchmarks work, and then to do the monitoring. If countries are ready to do what they did when they supported the recommendation, or they endorsed the recommendation of economic empowerment with all the issues related there, when they endorse our recommendation on public service representation leadership, the mainstreaming, I mean, they have been adhering to many of our instruments in the governance, in the access to justice, in the DAC, in the development community. We have a recommendation against sexual abuse in the provision of development after the Oxfam events. So we have a lot of tools, a lot of standards. We're not starting from the scratch. I think that the OECD has a very strong voice in these issues, but we want to say, let's just prioritize, let's look at how do we ensure that we do what you have heard from all of the panelists, to try to first put it behind the agenda, say no more, like the Me Too movement, as you said, or the fantastic Chileans dancing in this stadium, but that we can say, let's bring the awareness and say no more, this is not possible. I think we really need to work on the stereotyping, and we really need to work on the cultural norms and cultural, and this week we are going to have a seminar also with the CG, which is this database on cultural norms on toxic masculinities. I think that we really need to dig down what are the elements that are producing these outcomes in people's behavior. Because one thing is to build the whole infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, the justice infrastructure, that is important. We have a roundtable on access to justice too, so we can compare. Every single aspect needs to be compared and see how we can advance. But the fact is that we need the whole of the holistic kind of planning. If we would be able, and this is our dream, that all of the countries would have national strategies that can be compared across the board, that can be measured across the board, that can deliver across the board, I think we will be in another position. This is what we are promising we can do. We just launched today, and I see many of our representatives, the Working Party on Gender Mainstreaming, and I thank you. I'm telling you, please help us to put this high in the agenda, to put gender issues in the agenda, because we also need a lot of research. We cannot just go and speak our minds. We can do it always, but I think we really need to do it in an authoritative manner with a lot of substance and with a lot of elements that will support change and that will help us to advance this important agenda.
Great, thank you. We're starting to run out of time, and I realise there's probably some questions from the audience that you'd like to put to our panellists. I have plenty more questions, but I'm sure some of you have questions as well. So if you do have a question, please put up your hand. I think there is a roving mic, and if you can limit it to questions rather than statements, that would be useful because we are getting short on time. Any questions from the audience? There's one down here at the front here.
Thank you. I'm Marion Walsh from the Ministry of Justice in Ireland. I'm wondering if any of the panel can share some examples with us. Prevention has been mentioned as a key issue in terms of addressing this matter, and I'm just wondering if any of the panel have any knowledge of or can share with us some examples of best practice in terms of intervention with perpetrators and perpetrators programs that have been effective and that could be replicated elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Who'd like to go first on that? Ms. Trandles?
Well, we are working on it and developing it, but and prioritizing more preventive efforts also before the violence has happened. But we have a few examples. For example, we have a phone line also, of course, for women who are affected by violence or victims of violence, but also for males or people who have an undesired sexuality, and that is a broad spectrum, but it's also support on how can I stop using sexual violence, for example. So that's one example, but we're also developing more sort of methods on how you can get help to stop using violence.
Yes, please, Ms.
I would
Pennington.
say two fantastic resources. One is a report by DFID, What Works to Prevent Violence. And then there's a recent book about some of the innovations in the US, not outside, called No Visible Bruises, the central part of which is about programs that work with perpetrators. I think we don't understand enough about them and really how to work with them. So those would be two resources I would suggest.
And I would say also you should be, campaigns work, but it really needs to be the showing how shocking it is, because when it happens inside a house, you have some leniencies. When you see it, it works. But I think starting earlier in the school, I think that working with the biases also that we have in teachers and in educators in terms of not educating differently boy and girl. And then in the digital world, that this is also another angle in which we were commenting how worried we are about this becoming another tool for abusing women in a different way than we abuse men. There had been technological tools that some schools in the UK or schools in Mexico, I was in one presentation, with that boys will leave a virtual reality against bullying and against abusing girls. And I think these kind of interventions where kids just look how wrong it looks, and this can help transmitting. There are many interventions that the fact is that we also need to assess the impacts and we need to evaluate, and this is another aspect. I want to say that we also have Felicia Knoll with us, and we will be working with her in the Lancet Commission also, doing some research and with you.
Could I add two more examples? So a lot of the research, and this comes to the very powerful story that Carolyn told us, it's a misdiagnosis to think it's about anger management. It really is about issues of control. With men, number one, drinking is huge, and anything that people could do to start to try to reduce that. So I think, there's a lot more that we all need to know and to understand, but there's also a lot that we can do now.
Great, thanks. Another question here. The mic's just coming.
Thank you so much. I'm Angela Martins, the National Secretary for the Family in Brazil. And I truly enjoyed what you said about education. Start from education. We see that we have to have more education on human rights and mainly about masculinity and the role of both roles. And so I want to give this suggestion. If we could share more experience in this field of education and build an international agenda for because I think it is very important. We're trying to end, but in the end, we have to begin again, like building respect and this harmful masculinity that we have there too, that's very violent and very aggressive, and we could build another agenda together. So I'd like to share more with the OECD, and maybe we could build together. Just a suggestion. Thank you.
Any more questions? Any more questions? There's one here. 6 rows back there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Fiona Kyle. I'm the director of End Female Genital Mutilation European Network. And I really agree that education is key. We have a project at the moment called Gender ABC that we're implementing, including in Germany. And very quickly, one of the stories that came from our partner, they were in a school delivering the modules, and the boys in that school had a conversation if they would allow their wife, their future wife, 12-year-old boys in Germany, to work or not. And I think we really need to be aware of how deeply rooted these social norms are. But also, coming to my question, there's a huge pushback against comprehensive sexual education, which also includes tackling gender stereotypes. And I would really like to ask the panel how you are going to work with member states who are opposed, because we see it in the schools that we work in Germany, in Italy. Teachers are pushing back. They're saying, we don't want to teach this to our kids. But, you know, what is clear is we need to teach this because this is the root causes of gender-based violence.
Thank you. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Well, you know that from Chile, the UN, and I don't know if Asa is here because I'm quoting her, but she said, let's push back on the pushback, because the fact is there is a pushback. If you can no longer talk about reproductive rights, if you can no longer go into this kind of traditional school subjects, how are we going to be addressing the misbehavior at another level? And then you finish with some countries in Latin America that, because they stopped doing this kind of education, finish with 5 times the average of adolescent pregnancy. So I think that, again, this can be demonstrated that it's a public health problem, that is costly, that is bad. But the problem is, how do you bring them when the political leadership is not there? That's a very complicated task. And I can tell you, it's not only about very traditional society where you need to also fight the family laws, which then it becomes more complex, but even countries like France, when we were working with them to put together, and I think that the minister advanced that agenda, but we were working to to eliminate gender stereotypes from textbooks. We're not talking about violence. We're talking about not having only astronauts that are boys or tutus that are girls. I mean, it was impossible because there was a very strong conservative. So we cannot just impose and say, well, they're wrong and no, you need to work with them to show and produce this evidence on how much cohesive societies that do not allow for that deliver much better for people and for the economy. The problem is, how do you eliminate this stereotyping? We were in Latin America presenting the CG report last week with Nadine in the ECLAC. 44% of people, not men, people in Latin America think that kids suffer, Lawrence was there, kids suffer if mom works. They think that. 33% still think that if women earn more money than their partner is wrong. So, and then you reproduce this, you go for all these tools and all these efforts that we all do together, and then you see what we are producing in the internet, what we are producing in the television, what we're producing, these terrible objectifying images of girls and women and demeaning projections of what means to be a woman or a girl. I think that we are losing the battle. So it's a comprehensive, and I will invite the governments also to take a look at content. Content in the media is very harmful, and even Hollywood content. We are with the Me Too, but what you do see in the football games is, again, objectivizing women. So I think it's a whole comprehensive agenda. But education is key. I'm sure about that.
A quick comment. Yes, thank you, Ms. Seifert.
Yeah. I completely agree what you said, but it makes, in my opinion, one thing clear, that the fight against violence against women must be fought on the top of the political level and not only in the ministries for gender equality. Because, for example, just to show it on the German example, we can't influence and we can't say what is taught in the German schools. It's not even a matter of the federal government, it's a matter of the states, of the ministries of education in the states in Germany. And as long as the heads of the regional governments, and as long as the head of the federal government in Germany and in other states is not saying, okay, we really want to work on it and we really want to change it, it's really hard to make a change. And I completely agree that we have to focus on the education. I just heard 2 weeks ago a close friend of mine, she's living in Berlin, they're having a little daughter, she's going to kindergarten, and that's in the district of Berlin, it's called Prenzlauer Berg, where really high qualified liberal citizens live. They are working in culture, government, and so on and so on. So it should be a paradise for gender equality. But the little daughter is going to kindergarten, and in kindergarten, it's always split up the groups in girls and boys, and the girls are doing hairdressing and things, and the boys are getting out and fighting. And the boys are not allowed to do hairdressing and doing whatever girls things, and vice versa. And the girls are not allowed to play with a fireworks car, and so on and so on. And it looks like 100 years ago. And my friend was the only mother who was upset, and she talked to other parents saying, "Come on, that can't be. How can it happen?" And they were like, "Come on, calm down." And the boys want to fight, and it's like boys, blah blah blah. So we see when this is happening in the center of Berlin, right, and how it is happening everywhere else. And it really must be a broad agreement of society, of politics, and therefore, I mentioned the OECD as a platform for fighting against violence against women. That is so important to get it out of the corner just of gender questions.
Thank you, and that sets us very well, I think, for discussions the next day or so as well. So we've run out of time. I want to thank our distinguished speakers for sharing their knowledge and their experiences with us, and also the audience for questions. I know there's many more. There's many opportunities, I think, again, the next day or so to ask more questions. We're going to take a short break. If you can return to your seats before 4 p.m. so we can continue on time for the next speech and panel. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists.
Welcome back, everybody. I am honored to be able to introduce our next speaker to you. Mr. Luke Hart, along with his brother, Ryan, founded the advocacy group Cocoa Awareness after their father murdered their mother and their sister and then killed himself. While coping with this incredible trauma, Luke and his brother have been resolute in their campaign against domestic violence in all of its forms. They have published a book entitled Remembered Forever, and have trained thousands of police officers, National Health Service professionals, council staff, and the general public in how to identify, treat, and end domestic violence and abuse. I know we will all benefit from hearing about his experience and his expert knowledge of this issue. Mr. Hart?
Thank you very much for having me today. So on the 19th of July, 2016, my father shot and killed my mother Claire and my 19-year-old sister Charlotte in broad daylight with a shotgun, and he then turned the gun on himself. The murders occurred in our hometown, in the car park of a swimming pool, just 5 days after my brother Ryan and I had saved enough money to move Mum and Charlotte to a small rental house that was 5 miles down the road. We hoped they could finally live peacefully away from our father, but he stole that from both of them. Ryan and I had spent our entire lives studying, working, and saving so that one day we could give Mum and Charlotte the life they deserved away from our overbearing and controlling father. Yet despite how miserable he made us, we never recognized the physical danger that he'd always posed. We'd always seen this man as incredibly selfish, emotionally abusive, and deeply unpleasant. But we always believed there was a vast gap between our misery and murder. But there were many signs that neither we nor anyone else recognized for what they were. For example, our family was always struggling to pay for essentials, but at the time, we grew up thinking that our father was an equal victim in the poverty that characterized our lives. We never appreciated that he was the architect of it. Who in their right mind would drive their own family into poverty? But the lack of finances that our father created gave him the perfect excuse to restrict every aspect of our lives and to pin the blame elsewhere. Money became the narrative that strangled everything in our lives. He insisted that we couldn't afford the fuel to do hobbies, to see friends, or to go out, so we cancelled. In winter, he said that we couldn't afford to heat any of the rooms in the house, except just for the living room, where conveniently he could keep an eye on all of us. And in fact, we weren't even allowed to touch the light switches. The whole house was in darkness, except for the living room. And it was true that we couldn't do many of these things, but what he often failed to tell us was that he was disposing of money precisely so he had this narrative to entrap us. He would gamble and bet our money away online. He'd often even disappear on holidays by himself, not telling us where he was going or when he'd return. And he constantly quit jobs that we desperately needed to fund our lives. And when we were at university, he even gave our family's entire savings away to someone online that he'd never met. But our father always portrayed himself as a selfless protector. He said he was making the hard decisions for us so that we didn't have to worry. He often said we'd need to make sacrifices to get by. So he sacrificed our lives, believing that we were giving them up to make life easier for each other. But our father was a python, and every time we sacrificed, he simply squeezed tighter. And after he used finances to cut the outside world off, he found a whole range of ways to stop people from even coming in. For example, one of many was when our mum invited her friends over for coffee. Our father would often just follow them around the house, and he'd sit silently in the corner of whichever room they're in. And he would silently stare at them until they became so uncomfortable, they simply decided it was easier if they stopped seeing each other. And there were so many ways that our father made us think that we'd made the decision to isolate ourselves. But he created the very circumstances where it was far more miserable to do anything than simply to do nothing. We learned over time the only way to keep life manageable under our father was to become invisible and passive so that he no longer noticed us and interfered in our lives. We couldn't make our circumstances better, so we planned to save up and build a better life ourselves. But just days after our father murdered Mum and Charlotte, we witnessed a national media commentary that complimented our father, that called him a nice guy who was always caring. And the public and the media might well not have known what life had been like behind closed doors. But what truly shocked Ryan and I was, despite the murders of Mum and Charlotte, many still chose to insist that he was still a good man. And one report that really stung stated that the murders were understandable. And everywhere we read of speculation that the prospect of divorce was what drove our poor father, clearly against his will, to murder. And the suggestion was clear that we were accountable for provoking his actions. And in fact, we even witnessed an outpouring, even from Mum's close friends, for our father's mental health. And there were many reports that provided helplines for male suicide charities rather than domestic abuse charities. And it became very clear that this was being reported as our father's suicide and not the murders of Mum and Charlotte. Our father got the sympathy, as he always did, and the rest of us got the accountability, as usual. And in that moment, reading the press reports, it became crystal clear to Ryan and I that our society often considers men's feelings vastly more important than women's lives. And on top of that, we were frankly embarrassed by the standards held for men that allow them still to be good men after killing their own families, or his perspective of events over Mum's and Charlotte's. For instance, we had to read of the suicide note that our father had left behind at the murder scene. But it was never a suicide note to Mum and Charlotte, it was a murder note to them. We had to hear passers-by excuse our father's actions to kill, and in the same breath told Mum and Charlotte accountable for their actions to leave. And we had to read a story that began when we escaped our father and finished just 5 days later when he killed Mum and Charlotte. But that timeline was our father's narrative once again, because our story was 25 years of constant struggle to get away. The media were desperate to understand why our father had killed after we'd left, yet they had completely ignored the story of why we had to leave in the first place. And Ryan and I became aware of just how dangerous these kinds of narratives are, because the police investigation uncovered that our father had been searching online for reports of men who killed their families for months before he killed ours. And he saw the media justifying these murders. And in fact, the murder note that he left behind was constructed of the rationalizations that he'd found, copied and pasted into reasons to kill his own family. And when Ryan and I returned to the family home after the murders, we found that our father had actually been writing drafts of his murder note for months before we'd even started planning to leave. And we also found a to-do list that he'd produced in the days running up to the murders. And it was so coldly ordinary. He intended to buy a second-hand fridge that he was only going to use for 2 days. He returned a leased car on time the day before the murders to avoid a late fee. And 20 minutes before killing Mum, Charlotte and himself, he purchased and presented a parking ticket. It was very evident that our father was functioning as he always had on that day. This was not a hot-headed, emotional man who had lost control of himself. He was in cold-hearted control of even the tiniest details. This man was and always had been our father. And since the police investigation following the murders, many shocking revelations came out about our father's behaviour towards our mother that we never knew, particularly at the very start of the relationship, where he isolated her and embedded the fear and consequences that governed her decisions even decades later. And it's clear that our father killed Mum and Charlotte because he firmly believed he was justified to do so. And this intentionality was in stark contrast to the accidental and emotional language that was used in the media to describe our father's motivations. And the rampant apologism that we saw in the media and among locals for our father's murders left us with the unsettling feeling that our father had not gone anywhere. Many media outlets and onlookers were saying precisely what our father would have said, to narrate the events to us and to dominate our perception once again. In fact, many of the themes provided as excuses by the media were echoed precisely in our father's murder note. And it was then that we realized that many minds thought just as he did. And it was that moment that made us realize that what we'd lived with for our entire lives was not an isolated family problem. This was the socially condoned execution of insubordinate women. But despite the danger that we'd always lived in, no one had recognized the abuse for what it was, because our father concealed it, not only to the outside world, but even to us as victims. Abusers often aren't out-of-control idiots. They're often conspiring spin doctors who play with your perception like a puppeteer. And since abuse can't easily be seen, even when you're living with it, the only way to uncover it is to speak about it. But while abuse is considered private, this will never happen. And therefore, since the murders of Mum and Charlotte, my brother Ryan and I have dedicated ourselves to raising awareness of the coercive control that we'd suffered, but never had the words to articulate or understand. And we know how important it is to help others understand coercive control, because despite living with it for 25 years, the first time we'd heard of the term was when we were sat in the police station, just 2 days after the murders. And we looked up behind us and saw a poster which articulated the behaviours we'd been living with exactly. And it was only in the days after learning about coercive control that we began to realise the damage that we had suffered wasn't from what was done to us in single incidents. It was what was taken away from us over many years. The evidence of coercive control often isn't what's present, it's what's absent. It's the lack of freedom, it's the smallness of your life. It's the gaps that have been eroded away by the abuser. It's the very invisibility that you have learned and been shaped to become. Our experience was far closer to being hostages in our own home than it was a series of violent incidents. We always thought domestic abuse was violence, and that deceived us. Our father was smart enough, over the years leading up to the murders, to attack our human rights instead of our bodies directly, and it worked. We'd always seen our father's coercive and controlling behaviours as a precursor to potential violence, not as an indication of danger in itself. And as long as he wasn't violent, no matter how bad life was, at least we were still safe, or so we thought. But the violence that we thought might be a warning all came at once. We'd always believed the stereotype that domestic abuse was regular violence. And it was only later that we discovered that in the UK, nearly a third of domestic homicides have no history of violence. Our experiences were in fact incredibly common, and in many cases the murders erupt directly out of coercively controlling behaviours. And in many cases, again, the victims and perpetrators are not known to the police or services. Never in my life had I seriously considered that anyone would murder their own family. I'd always thought deadly violence was perpetrated by strangers in the street, and between men it mostly is. I wouldn't have believed that the most likely place for women and children to be killed is at home, and the most likely person to kill them is a family member or partner. It was only after the murders that I realised my understanding of the world was only of what was public. Women's suffering is often relegated to private and therefore silence, and then we're easily excused from having to reflect or act upon it. And the laws and regulations in public often do very little to help these women and children who are relegated to invisibility in the dark, hidden, private world of patriarchs, where there are no witnesses to see their suffering and no one willing to speak of it. We need to confront just how gendered our notion of private actually is. Privacy for men to do as they wish, and the privacy for women to suffer in silence. Many women's entire existences are confined to men's private lives, and the women who need the most help barely have a public life to speak of. So my brother Ryan and I wrote our book, Remembered Forever, to memorialise our mum and our sister Charlotte, and to bring the problem of domestic abuse, and particularly coercive control, into the public. And the more that we've spoken, the more we've been asked to share our story, because so few men speak about it. And we use our voices as men to particularly highlight the male entitlement at the root of the coercive controlling mindset. Our father was not mentally ill. He was driven by a radicalized ideology of male supremacy. Coercive control was how he policed this order every day, and the murders were how he enforced it. Our father killed Mum and Charlotte for moral reasons, with an almost crusade-like mentality, his good versus our evil. He saw his enforcement of coercive control as a kind of natural law, which he treated with an almost religious sanctity. Our father, to us, was a terrorist who killed for gendered rather than religious or political ideals. And what's most shocking of all is that domestic murderers like our father are an order of magnitude more deadly than religious or politically motivated terrorists in the UK. Yet our society treats men like our father as nothing more than a vague nuisance. And we have to recognise what's going on inside these men's heads. It's almost taken for granted that the most dangerous terrorists often aren't persistently violent. Instead, they cultivate a dangerous worldview while trying their absolute best to remain invisible. And one day, they act suddenly and catastrophically upon that worldview. And we need to recognise that many domestic abusers operate in precisely the same way. Not only will our societies always intervene too late if we only focus on abuse as primarily violent and visible, but it will never stop the abuse, because abusers will often learn to adapt to more insidious and sophisticated forms of coercive control. And until we tackle the worldview that lies behind such actions, our attempts to end domestic abuse will be as effective as trying to behead a hydra. We should be encouraging men to challenge the very notion that controlling women is okay. For many men, humiliation is defined by not being able to control women and not being able to exert your will upon them. The coercive controlling mindset is not an anomaly, it's a core part of a masculine identity. And it's important that we have more men speaking out, because the value system of abusers means they often will not listen to women. And we need to help more people understand that challenging men's gendered values is not from malicious man-hating. Instead, it's to increase men's freedom and self-determination. And only when men change will women and children ever be truly safe. Mum Charlotte, Ryan and I had to live each day thinking that we were alone, thinking that our lives belonged only in silence, and that our misery was private. And despite how difficult our lives were, we could never articulate or understand why, because we'd never heard anyone speak of what we were living with. And it's only now that we see the difficulties in our lives were manufactured by our father. He found power in problems because he made us believe that they were always our fault. And at the time, we blamed ourselves endlessly for our circumstances. Yet despite the most immense struggles, Mum and Charlotte always responded to their suffering with more compassion towards others. And it's from their example of bravery and strength that Ryan and I were forged. And it's from that that we hope to forge their legacy. Thank you.
Mr. Hart, thank you for this very powerful testimony and for providing a man's voice and point of view. I speak for everyone here when I say we are grateful to you for sharing your story and your incredibly important message with us. We appreciate your courage in standing here in front of us today. Thank you. I'm afraid this is going to be another one of these slightly awkward transitions to our next panel. We may also need a few minutes to recover from this testimony. I would like now to turn to our next panel, entitled Call to Justice, Preventing and Ending Intimate Partner Violence. This panel will be moderated by Mr. Edwin Lau, the Senior Counselor in the OECD's Public Governance Directorate. Mr. Lau, distinguished panelists, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As people get settled, I'll just get us started because we have a very short amount of time and a very tall order to prevent and end intimate partner violence. We will see what we can do in this time, but I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Edwin Lau from our Public Governance Directorate, and as Gabriella had mentioned in a previous session, the Public Governance Directorate is like a veritable treasure chest of solutions and policy approaches to addressing the complex problems of our society. But I would like to really thank the organizers for this conference today because it brings together one of the missing pieces for us to deal with these societal problems, and that's to listen to the testimonies of the people, the real people who are facing those problems. And Charlotte mentioned earlier how it's important to give control or to give a voice to the survivors in order to be able to understand the survivor journey as we develop our policies. And Luke, in his very powerful presentation just now, was also talking about reclaiming that narrative. And I think these are extremely important elements so that we're not just looking at supply-driven solutions, and that we're looking at demand solutions. So we're here to talk about how our justice systems can respond to this terrible problem that is facing all of our countries. And what we see is that while justice systems are not the only element of the solution, that for many people, this is the first time in which they find information about their rights. It's the first time that they are able perhaps to get some shelter from the violence that is threatening them. It is the first time that they have access to some of the social services that can support them as they look to get out of the situation that they're in. And yet, we've heard already in the opening panel that oftentimes the systems in place fall short because they are operated around another logic that's not necessarily a logic of the needs of the survivor. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a statement by Minister Andrea Katic, and then after that we will have a panel discussion. So Minister Katic was elected to the National Assembly of the Republic of Slovenia in 2014 and appointed as Minister of Defense in 2015 and 2018. In September 2018, the National Assembly of the Republic of Slovenia appointed her the Minister of Justice. So, Minister Katic.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not easy to speak after you heard so sad story, but with clear and powerful message. Most of us live assured that the family environment is and should be the safest place for any individual. How could we not? We are mothers and fathers, wives and husbands, daughters and sons. We cherish our homes. We take care of our family members and beloved ones. But, as we already heard, it is not like that for everyone. Research shows that for some people, home can be the most dangerous place to live in. It is especially true for women, children, the elderly, and the people with disabilities. According to our latest national survey on domestic violence, almost 50% of women older than 15 has experienced at least one form of violence. Half of them experience psychological violence. A quarter of them reported being subjected to physical violence. A quarter of them were subjected to other types, such as restriction of freedom of movement, use of the property, and various types of economic and sexual violence. And the fact remains that in 90.8% of these cases, the perpetrators are men, husbands, fathers, brothers, sons. Data from international surveys are not significantly different. The right to personal security and live without violence is one of the fundamental human rights. But the state's responsibility to uphold this right doesn't end with its duty and competency to prosecute the perpetrators. It is also has a positive obligation to respect human rights. This positive obligation entails that the state should set up efficient measures for the protection and support of the survivors that prevent re-victimization. It also includes the state's responsibility to support awareness-raising campaigns. Slovenia has made great progress in amending the legislation in this area in the last decade. In 2008, the Domestic Violence Prevention Act was adopted. It defines domestic violence in all forms, while addressing the role, task, and ways of cooperation of different state bodies and non-governmental organizations in dealing with domestic violence. The law specifically protects the most vulnerable social groups by providing special measures for the protection of the children and paying special attention to the treatment of persons with disabilities and the elderly. Besides that, we are currently working on a new national program for the prevention of domestic violence and violence against women and girls. As far as Slovenian criminal justice legislation goes, I must mention the new criminal code was adopted in 2008 and amended in 2015. It now defines domestic violence, stalking, and forced marriage as crimes. In 2019, we amended the Criminal Procedure Act putting the victim of crime at the forefront and emphasizing the aspects of the victim's needs in the criminal proceedings. It now clearly defines what information must be provided to survivors upon the first contact with the competent authorities in pretrial or criminal proceedings, as well as information that she or he must have in those proceedings. In order to determine the existence of special protection needs, the competent authorities must now assess the level of survivors' exposure to re-victimization, intimidation, and retaliation, and present to them the possibility of appeal. Last year, the Ministry of Justice published a brochure on survivors' rights in 6 languages, which is available to them at their first contact with the competent authority, usually the police. Furthermore, we are now considering changing our criminal code regarding criminal offenses against sexual integrity, where we would like to implement a model of consent, which requires a partner's clear consent to sexual act and defines sexual conduct without undoubted consent from both partners a criminal offense. Consequently, coercion and threat should no longer be a precondition for the existence of a criminal offense. And I must point out that I was rather surprised when I faced resistance to proposed changes coming from some judges, prosecutors, and other legal experts. A comprehensive study on this subject shows that in Slovenia, victims of such acts often, too often, slip through the cracks of the criminal justice system. Allow me to give you an example to illustrate this frustrating situation. If you take another's property, for example, a mobile phone, with the intention of unlawfully appropriating it, this action is considered as larceny, stealing. You can be prosecuted and convicted for it and face up to 3 years in prison. It doesn't matter whether the object was taken in the absence of victim's clear consent or not. It is clearly a criminal offense. On the other hand, when we deal with acts against one's sexual integrity, coercion and threat are of substantial importance for it to be considered a criminal offense. Do we really value private property that much and care for one's personal integrity that little? Something is very wrong here. Finally, there are also the awareness-raising campaigns. Domestic and intimate partner violence is still considered a social taboo. On the other hand, being less educated on this topic is one of the major risk factors. Women should not have to feel embarrassed or stigmatized when faced with domestic violence and should not hesitate to seek protection. Survivors should be assured that they will not be subjected to victim blaming in their seek for justice. Hearing Charlotte's and Luke's heartbreaking testimony must serve as a wake-up call for all of us. If we want to live in a better world, one without violence, we must step together and make use of high-level international conferences such as this one to adopt and exercise zero-tolerance policies toward domestic violence. This is the whole point of us being here today, and it is enshrined in the call to action for OECD here, where we do not speak of fighting the violence, but of ending it. There is a clear distinction between the two statements, and I can only express my full support for the call. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to use this opportunity to appeal to policymakers of those states who haven't ratified the Istanbul Convention yet. Please consider this initiative in the light of what you heard today here and make an important step towards raising the level of protection from domestic violence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Ketic, and for both pointing out what Slovenia has done in this area, but also what more needs to be done. We have a very distinguished panel today with quite a bit of expertise and experience in their respective justice systems. So without further ado, I will introduce them and then we'll begin our first round of questions. So first of all, we have Ms. Marcela Lozardo. She is appointed by President Alberto Fernandez as the Minister of Justice and the Human Rights of Argentina in December. And she is a lawyer specialized in civil and commercial law. During her years as Vice Minister of the Ministry of Justice, she promoted updating legislation on mediation as well as access to justice centers, bringing public policies closer to vulnerable sectors. So, and then after that, we will have Lady Rafferty, who is currently the Lord Justice of Appeals for England and Wales, a position to which she was appointed in 2011. She has held a number of senior positions during her distinguished career, often being the first woman to hold them. In 2017, she was appointed the Vice Chairman of the Judicial Appointments Commission. After that, we'll have Mr. Marcin Romanowski, who is the Undersecretary of State at the Ministry of Justice in Poland. During his professional career, he has been, among others, the Director of the Institute of Justice, the Plenipotentiary of the Minister of Justice for Information Technology and Cybersecurity, and for the Justice Fund, and advisor to the Minister of Justice. And then Ms. Laurie Sargent is the Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs portfolio at the Department of Justice Canada. She is a graduate of McGill University Faculty of Law, and she joined the Department of Justice in 2002, where she has worked on a wide range of domestic and international human rights law and policy files. And then finally, I saved the most difficult to pronounce for last, Ms. Sigurbjörnsdóttir, who holds a master's degree in law from the University of Iceland, and during her studies, she has served as both a journalist as well as a police officer in the Southern District of Iceland. In 2016, she was elected to Parliament, and since September 2019, she has served as Iceland's Minister of Justice. So with that, I'm going to turn back to Minister Lozardo. So the question to you is, with regard to the legal representation and assistance, it's crucial for ensuring justice, access to justice for intimate partner violence survivors. So in recent years, the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights of Argentina has taken steps to address this. This includes setting up a body of lawyers for victims of gender-based violence within the ministry. Could you tell us how this body works, and how does it help to provide better legal representation and aid for survivors?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for all people here, all women and all men. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Luke. You're a great, great person. I am sure that men and women will be together making the difference. If not, it won't be possible. First, let me distinguish between the concept of domestic violence, etymologically arising from the Latin term domus, at home. In our country, the prevailing doctrine in matter considers that the proper term is violence against women, because if we refer to violence intra-family or domestic terms, it would avoid other forms of violence against women. In addition, I highlight the use of the term survivors because victim is a generic concept that puts women in a position of a passive individual without exit. Instead, survivor makes reference to the possibility of a woman to rebuild herself as an individual full of rights. Now, in order to answer your question, and before mentioning the functions of the body of lawyers for victims of gender based on violence, I would like to stress that the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights started working on these issues in 1996, since the enactment of Law 24417 that created the Interdisciplinary Body and Protection Against Family Violence, which is still in force. It is a technical team providing support to the national justice composed of professionals specialized in violence, gender, and human rights issues. It prepares reports on risk and family interaction in accordance with the applicable regulation to establish the dynamic of a family and the risk faced by victims. This is the result of considering the terms and scopes of our regulation within the law on protection against family violence, the law on comprehensive protection of rights of girls, boys, and teenagers, and the law on comprehension protective to prevent, punish, and eradicate violence against women. The Victims Against Violence program was created in 2006 through a ministerial resolution. This program initially was within the sphere of the Ministry of Domestic Affairs, and since 2008, it is within the purview of the Minister of Justice. These programs keeps providing assistance, guidance, and accompanying victims of sexual and family violence. To this end, there is an interdisciplinary team made up by psychologists and social workers trained in these issues. Free telephones helping working 24 hours every day and available for this program. These telephone helplines coordinate their participation with mobile teams of professionals that personally act when victims are in urgent situation or dangers, coordinating with public health service if it's necessary. The program also trains and raises awareness in the community regarding gender-based violence, judicial actors, teachers, health profession, etc. In this regard, in the year 2008, in 3 schools of the Argentine Federal Police, the subject, Introduction to Knowing, Addressing, and Preventing Violence. This step is very, very important, was added as a required course. To date, professionals from the program keep on teaching this subject. Later, in 2011, the Argentine Commission for Coordination Actions to Prepare Sanctions related to gender violence was created by a ministerial resolution. The mission of this commission is to advise the branches of the states about implementing the law 264085 on comprehensive protection to prevent, punish, and eradicate violence against women. Lastly, the body of lawyers for victims on gender-based violence was created by law enacted in 2015 and is within the sphere of the Argentine Minister of Justice and Human Rights for the purpose of ensuring victims of gender-based violence their access to justice. To this end, it provides free specialized legal representation in this matter so that women get legal representation during the legal proceeding for the defense and exercise to rights. The body assists victims of human trafficking, gender-based violence, sexual abuse, perpetrated against women, girls, boys, and teenagers.
Thank you so much, Minister Luzardo. It seems that taking this multidisciplinary approach really helps you to assess the level of risk and therefore to have a more complete service to survivors.
Yes, that's right. And we are getting better numbers when we have the survives.
Okay, all right. So the OECD Access on Roundtables for Justice have identified many barriers to accessing legal services for victims of violence. So I wanted to ask Lady Rafferty, in many cases, IPV survivors face the challenge of navigating multiple channels of a judicial system because they're faced with multifaceted legal needs. These are always complicated cases, as we've seen. Yet most judicial systems are fragmented and siloed, which results in proceedings being addressed in separate forums with multiple lawyers. So what reforms could we take to address those silos, and how can we make sure that courts are accessible to all survivors?
First of all, I'd like to add my voice to the list of those who have thanked the OECD for the privilege of this invitation. My task in my 3 to 5 minutes allotted is to help you with how the United Kingdom courts approach the task, the unwelcome task, of course, with which you're by now familiar. First of all, women, it's generally women. Of course, partner violence is gender blind. let us remind ourselves of that, but predominantly women, when they are complainants in respect of violence, will find themselves in one or two jurisdictions. One is the criminal courts, and the second is the family courts. I need to give you a little sketch of how our criminal courts and family courts work, because I know that they are different from many of your own systems. In a criminal court, if an offender in the dock contests his guilt, the decision on whether he is guilty or not guilty will be made by a jury of 12 members of the public selected at random. They will be assisted on the law by the judge. Additionally, we have an adversarial system, so advocates will appear for the Crown, who will prosecute, and for the defence, who will defend. In the family courts, it is a judge or a panel of judges who will make a fact-finding decision and then institute a disposition of some sort. No jury. The other big difference between those two courts is that in crime, the standard of proof is that a jury can only convict if it is sure of guilt. In a family court, if an allegation is advanced, it will succeed as long as, on the balance of probabilities, it is more likely to be true than not. So they are very different arenas. They are both striving to achieve justice, and you don't need me to tell you that many, many times when a woman is the complainant in an instance such as this, she has children. So it's more unusual than usual to see both jurisdictions involved. Then there's the complication of timelines. Crime involves liberty of the subject, so it trumps everything else. So in a perfect world, one I've never encountered, ever, matters would go smoothly and fluidly. So the criminal trial would start, finish, there would be a disposition, and then the family proceedings would follow. Life's not like that. I'm just looking at Charlotte now. Yes, I thought she would nod. She's nodding. It's not like that. So the UK judges are doing a constant adjusting and balancing and awareness of the other's jurisdiction exercise from start to finish. The judicial mindset now in 2020 in the United Kingdom, this is a view I have formed, I could be wrong, I don't think I am, is that it understands that the area in which we are all interested is full of complications. We train judges exhaustively. We train them in the Judicial College when they are appointed. We refresh their training throughout their judicial lives, and we start training from the level of magistrates, and we stop, for these purposes, at the level of the circuit bench, which is the boiler room of the serious cases. Magistrates to us mean something different from magistrates to you. They're not an inquisitorial role. They are, again, 3 members of the public who want to do their public duty and are volunteers and will hear a case with the assistance of a legally qualified clerk. But they are well trained. I know they're well trained because I am the chairman of the Judicial College, which does the training. But more importantly, they are consistently trained all their judicial lives. And I wondered, if Edwin will give me long enough to do it, whether you would be interested in the 7 goals that we teach them for what they should be aiming for in this area. First of all, it's important to convey to the public that abuse such as this will not be tolerated. Secondly, the aim should be to stop the abusive and the violent behaviour. Third, the aim should be to protect the complainant. Fourth, to protect the children and other family members. Fifth, to rehabilitate the perpetrator and provide the opportunity for re-education and changes to behaviour. Sixth, to provide reparation for the abused individual where it's possible. And seventh, to hold the perpetrator accountable for the abusive behaviour and for stopping those behaviours. I hope you find that those 7 goals interesting. They are part of the way our judiciary has, I would say, matured into the age in which it finds itself. It doesn't operate now in the 1970s or 80s. And if I have a chance later on, I'll come back to how adaptable and thirsting for knowledge I think it is.
Thank you very much, Lady Rafferty. We at the OECD like very much principle-based approaches, so thank you for sharing those principles with us, and I think it is part of the way in which we modernize our judiciaries to face these issues. So next we have Undersecretary Romanowski. I would like to ask you, a common barrier that survivors face is accessing justice is information. So for example, information about protective orders, legal aid, court proceedings may be hard to find or difficult to understand. So in such situations, an additional burden is placed on survivors to find out, to understand their rights, the information about the laws, the proceedings, and the services. So based on your experience, how can justice ministries help to make this more widely available? And how can we help ensure that this information is understandable to the survivors?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this meeting. I would like to point out that the cooperation with OECD is very important, is always very important to us, and I think that such a meeting is necessary for an effective cooperation and exchange of experiencing. And in response to this question, I'm going to indicate what kind of actions are undertaken by the Ministry of Justice in Poland. First of all, we publish on our website information about the possibility of obtaining free legal help or civic counseling. In addition, we extend databases of government and local government institutions providing assistance to people affected by domestic violence, including a telephone database. This information is also placed on the websites of courts, prosecutors' offices, and the police headquarters. The Ministry of Justice organizes conferences, seminars, and social campaigns on violence in various aspects. We cooperate with many bodies and institutions, among others at the annual organization of the Crime Victim Assistance Week, which takes part in February. This action aims to promote public awareness of victims' rights and knowledge about the possibilities of claiming their rights. In Poland, people experiencing violence can obtain the necessary information thanks to functioning of the free legal aim system and of the Justice Fund. It's also worth to underline that we carry out many activities related to publications of the rights of victims of crimes. In Poland, we have also a crime victims assistance program now for years 2019-2024, and the program we provide the establishment of about 400 victim assistance centers. And the victim can become the assistance, legal assistance, psychological material also, but also of course the information. In the framework of this program from 2019, the Justice Fund, it's a part of Ministry of Justice, had financed the helpline, victim support line. This is a 24-hour helpline for victims of crime, including, of course, domestic violence. And phone shifts are carried out by psychologists and lawyers and first contact persons. Phone calls can also be held in English, Russian and Ukrainian language. In addition, in the framework of this program, the Justice Fund is carrying out the media campaign We Help Justly, in order to increase the public awareness of the available forms of assistance. And in my opinion, concerning the information, only such comprehensive solutions make easier for victims of domestic violence, make easier this full access to justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romanowski. Okay, now I'm going to move on to Deputy Minister Sargent, Assistant Deputy Minister, I'm sorry. There's no one-size-fits-all solution in addressing violence, and the needs of survivors are not universal. So in part because of the experiences of women due to their different personal characteristics and intersections of their individual circumstances. So with this in mind, how can our justice institutions ensure that they're responding to the needs of all women and not just some? How can we create survivor-centered justice pathways that are responsive to women of different backgrounds, such as women from indigenous communities?
Thank you very much, and it really is an honor and privilege to be here on behalf of the Department of Justice. We have so appreciated our opportunities to collaborate with the OECD and others on issues of access to justice, and of course, combating intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. And I would just note, as a mother of 2 children, a boy and a girl, and someone with a human rights background who's lectured them repeatedly on the importance of respect and equality, there is nothing more powerful than the stories we heard today from the survivors about what it really means to experience that violence and the removal, essentially, as they said, of human rights, and how important it is for us to be all having those conversations with our children. I truly believe that's probably the best way that we are going to actually combat violence, as everyone has really been pointing to. All that said, in terms of an actual justice response and how it could potentially be tailored to the experiences of particular communities, Canada does have a long history of working with victims of violence. Actually, 2020 marks the 20th anniversary of our federal victims strategy in Canada, which has been aiming to give victims a more effective voice in the criminal justice system. So for the past 20 years, the strategy's, I would say, been successfully designing and in many ways adapting, as well as delivering, policy and program initiatives in support of victims and survivors of crime, with a considerable amount of federal funding going primarily to our provinces and territories. So we are a federal state. Much of the on-the-ground work supporting victims is done through provincial territorial governments. And the Victims Fund generally has been seeking, I would say, to try to get its funding out to really the on-the-ground organizations. We heard a bit about that earlier this morning. Having it being local will always be more effective, especially in a country as vast as ours. But in light of the question about creating survivor-centered pathways, responsive in particular to certain communities, and I will focus here on Indigenous women and girls, I wanted to focus on a few specific Indigenous-informed initiatives that have been taking place in Canada over the past many years, and particularly since, of course, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry, launched in 2016 and reported again in 2019 with its 231 calls for justice, a major prescription for how we can better approach justice in Canada. But to date, some of the activities have included funding projects and activities that increase awareness of and access to culturally responsive victim services, with language, cultural traditions, and so on being key. Northern-specific activities and projects to build the capacity of those working locally with victims of crime and survivors in remote northern communities, which is a very different reality, of course, from our urban centres. Capacity building among child advocacy centres to provide culturally grounded services for Indigenous child victims, and sponsoring knowledge exchanges, a little bit like this one, bringing together multidisciplinary perspectives, including, and we're being much more conscious about ensuring we have Indigenous perspectives and experiences being put forward, in turn, including those of child victims, victims with disabilities, victims of sexual assault, and perspectives on the concept of restorative justice as a means of also finding new pathways in terms of responding to violence. I would also like to highlight a recent best practice in Canada, the creation of Family Information Liaison Units, or FILUs, as we affectionately call them now in Canada, that have really had a significant impact on enhancing access to services for family members of missing or murdered Indigenous women. Recognizing the need to respond to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, the FILUs have represented a new and unique model of service for family members of the victims, in this case, of course, deceased or disappeared, ensuring a culturally grounded, trauma-informed team made up of navigators, as they're called, who actively work with government institutions and agencies on behalf of family members to obtain information they are seeking about what happened to their loved ones. Before these teams were created, that information about their loved ones and the trial process, investigations, and so on was often scattered all over the place in different parts of government, in the courts, in the police, and often inaccessible to family members, including due to factors like the historical nature of the event. It was long past, geographic distance between family members and where the crime actually occurred. And systemic barriers, most notably a lack of trust of the survivors and the families in the police. So through these FILUs, which really have again acted as an intermediary, many family members across Canada are now receiving up-to-date, accurate information about crimes that had been committed, whether or not there was an investigation, trial, or conviction. And in some cases, this has helped to clear up long-standing misinformation about what happened to their loved ones, bringing some sense of closure. These FILUs are reuniting family members, bringing the remains of loved ones home to the families so that they can be buried or appropriate ceremonies held. FILUs have also provide an opportunity for family members to connect directly with government agencies to learn more about why particular decisions were made. As part of their processes, FILUs are assisting families in coping with grief and trauma, and they've been organizing with local Indigenous community partners, and that local community involvement has been key. There have been family gatherings, ceremonies, connections with elders, and access to culturally grounded supports. So the criminal justice partners who've been involved in these ceremonies have often also learned a great deal about the impact of the violence that these communities have experienced. Recognizing the importance of this program, the Minister of Justice recently announced that the funding would be extended for another 3 years. And this will be part of the National Action Program, National Action Plan response to the Missing and Murdered Inquiry that we know we need to build and really develop a response in collaboration and partnership with Indigenous peoples, because that's the only way that we are going to actually make tangible progress in this area. Thanks.
Thank you, ADM. I think that it's very interesting that you're recognizing that this is not just information for the individual, but for their support network and their resource network, because that's, I think, very important for resilience. So thank you. I'm going to ask one last question to Minister Sigurjónsdóttir, and then I'm going to inform the rest of the panel. We will do one lightning round where you will have an opportunity to say in 1 minute your advice on developing survivor-centered justice pathways. But before, we want to give the minister her share of time to respond. And what we see that oftentimes for victims and survivors of violence, that police are the front line. They're the first to witness what is happening. And so as the first public actors interacting with survivors, it's very important that they are equipped to be able to respond. And as a former policewoman yourself, I noticed in your bio, how can the Ministry of Justice in Iceland support that role of the police? And what do you think that ministries of justice in general can do to ensure that policing is responsive to the needs of survivors?
Thank you so much, and thank you for this great conference. First, I think it's the utmost importance to ensure that the police, who is usually the first to arrive at a scene, have special expertise and in the consequence of the domestic violence, and to be able to meet the survivors with both understanding and due to consideration at the scene. Such as authorization to expel an offender from the home, and to offer psychological support and counseling to survivors. This will be done by, of course, ensuring that the police officer education includes knowledge of the nature of these offences and the consequences for the survivors. But it's also important to ensure retraining of police officers to provide them with the skills and ability to deal with these sensitive issues at the scene and in the case. And furthermore, it is important to ensure that the police have remedies available as well to help the survivors want and need, that they have access to specialists who can provide assistance and counseling, which is why family justice centers in Iceland has played an important role for survivors, where we can break down the barriers of different systems like the social services, the police and the justice. And they are publicly funded and have professional staff who can provide important help for the survivor and advice to the survivor of domestic violence. And then it's, of course, also we need to make sure that the atmosphere and the attitude amongst police officers is to serve, is to help, is to listen, and is to understand when they come to these scenes. But they also need to have the law with them, because it's important that states and the police has a specific provision in the criminal legislation which applies to violence between intimate partners. And Iceland introduced such provision in our criminal code in 2016, and doing so sends quite clear message that society, to the society, that intimate partner violence is not tolerated at all, and that such violations are not the private concern of the parties. And the state is concerned, of course, about the well-being of the citizens, and one aspect is of this is to publicly oppose violence against women and children in their homes, and to make it as well clear in the law that it is domestic abuse to children to watch violence at home. They don't need to be part of the violence. So I think it's, of course, many things that we need to do, and the family centers in Iceland is one part that we have had a great opportunity to get all the system together to work for the survivors, but also to see certain police jurisdiction in Iceland that have begun to offer psychological counseling service to victims who come forward, and to support them throughout the process of pressing charges and follow-up investigation and prosecution. And international research have, of course, shown that processing of domestic abuse cases has a negative impact on survivor, physical and mental health, and offering support through of counseling is a measure to reduce these negative impacts, because we want the survivors to come forward and go the whole system with charges. And we have been looking at every step that the survivor need to take in the step of coming to the police, and every step in the system, and to see what we can do better. And we have made a lot of changes throughout the whole system, just to go through it with survivors. What was the hardest thing in every step, and what is the possibilities we can do to make it easier for them.
Thank you very much, Minister. In fact, the OECD has done a case study on a report called Systems Approaches to Public Sector Challenges, in which we identified what Iceland has done in combating violence against women as one of the cases of how to apply systems approaches to complex problems. And it was this interdisciplinarity of the approach that we found so appealing. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. In fact, this leads us to our final lightning round, in which we have been talking about how can we achieve survivor-centered justice pathways? How do we help people maneuver through this sometimes Byzantine system? So I'm giving each of you 1 minute to respond in terms of what your main challenges and approaches you would identify to achieve that. So, Minister Lizardo.
Access to justice centers were created in 2003. In that moment, I was Vice Minister of Justice then, and now I'm Minister of Justice. I came back. There are ministerial offices located all over the national territory, mainly in areas where the social vulnerability.
We get it, we understand.
Aiming at bringing public policies ensuring the exercise of the rights closest for the population. Such centers are made up by interdisciplinary teams composed of psychologists, social workers, and lawyers specially trained in gender issues and with a comprehensive justice and human rights. Access to justice centers do not only provide legal counseling in civil, criminal, commercial, labor, and social security matters. They also make referrals to free legal representation service for individuals who have low incomes. Community activities are also organized within these offices to strengthen the capacities of community members in the exercise of their rights, and informative material is handed over on sexual and reproductive health, because this is a very important theme. How to prevent the adverse evidence, among other actions. As to no legal service, these centers assist citizens in obtaining their official documents, retirement benefits, disability benefits, children benefits, welfare benefits, etc. In addition, they develop actions regarding community health, such as primary medical care, vaccinations, campaigns, breastfeeding, and a comprehensive approach to addictions. This is very important for the people because they get this service interact with other ministers, actions for assisted migrants, promoting completion of mandatory formal education. I go on?
No, I think that's a very complete answer. Thank you.
Are you sure?
Actually, I'm sure that people will want to know more afterwards.
Yes.
So, Lady Rafferty.
Okay. 1 minute, 1 minute. Right. You do 3 things. You address fairness, you give a lot of explanation, and then the judge robustly case manages. Fairness. Most people are fair-minded. It's inevitable that in any justice system, nothing will go precisely as one party or other wishes. It won't. If you make them aware by explanation of what could happen, might happen, the best, the worst, you make it easier for them to achieve their innate fair-mindedness, particularly if you let raw emotion drop. So that's fairness as a consequence of good explanation. And once you've done it, once you've explained, and you've put them in the position fairly to understand, you do what you said you would do. You run the case as you told them you would, so it's robust case management. You don't cave in to anybody's demands. This is what I said would happen. This is the fair way. I've explained it. Now do it.
Thank you very much. We see why justice is a lady.
1 minute?
Yes. So, Undersecretary Romanowski.
Thank you very much. Well, in my opinion, the most important elements of justice for those affected by violence are the following. The first one, ensuring broad access to legal assistance at the stage preceding the initiation of civil or criminal proceedings. The second one is appropriate preparation by police officers, prosecutors, or judges for work with people experiencing violence apart from the obvious knowledge in the field of law. The staff should be prepared in the field of psychology, which teaches how to deal with people who have suffered from violence. And the last one, I would say, it will be the existence of civil and criminal procedures that will allow the person experiencing violence having a sense of security, especially in the apartment, and having a feeling of full and consciously participation in the proceeding. In Poland, advanced works are currently underway to introduce an order made by police against the person using violence to immediately leave the flat they occupy. And the order will apply for a period of 2 weeks. It will be regulation similar to that in Austria. I think it will be the last important part of the regulation for the people affected by the violence. But shortly say, first, legal assistance as soon as possible. Second one, preparation. And the last one, just a sense of security. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary. And now ADM Sargent.
So I'm trying to think of what I can actually add in 1 minute to the discussion because there have been so many good ideas. I think the two key pieces I would add to what is absolutely crucial, which is clearly the multidisciplinary support to victims. And I would say that Canada has a lot to learn on that front from probably Iceland and many others. But in addition to that, I would focus on data, good understanding of the problem, and as I gather now, because I'm learning more about the OECD, the point of benchmarking and measuring, are our policies actually improving the situation on the ground? And in Canada, we do face a challenge on that front. We have some good data, but a lot of it, again, is scattered around in different levels of government and in the courts and in the police and so on. So having a data strategy to support what you're trying to do as a policy objective is critical. And then having the ability to keep tweaking the laws. I mean, have a stable, solid, of course, legal foundation founded in equality rights for Canada. Of course, that's a protection found in our charter. But then all the more practical realities of a criminal procedure or family court proceedings. We need to listen to survivors. We need to listen to victims and figure out how to adapt our processes because, frankly, they have not been very effective in terms of protecting the rights of victims of violence. I would say in Canada, you know, we swung very much to the rights of the accused for a fair period of time, especially after the Charter came into force in 1982. And since there's been a bit of a rebalancing, looking at sexual assault laws in particular, protections for victims, testimonial aids, ensuring that presumptions of what evidence can go in, how you can use victims' own sexual history and so on, you know, that should be discarded, basically, presumptively discarded as irrelevant. All of those pieces are so crucial to actually having a process that's going to have a just outcome. So there's fairness on the micro level, but then there's the bigger systemic kind of approach. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And lastly, Minister Sigurjonsdottir.
Thank you so much. First, that the need of survivors is the key focus in investigating and handling offenses. The second, keep the survivor well informed throughout the investigation process. For example, instead of being notified through official letters, survivors should be notified in person, where they receive detailed feedback and where they are granted opportunities to seek some clarification and ask questions about their case and the status of it every time. And this enhances the most important trust in the system and thereby increases the likelihood that the victim will seek resolution through official channels. Our system also needs to be human, because we are dealing with human all the time. And at last, the silence shrouding these violations needs to be broken. Domestic violence is not only the business of households member. It's our business, it's all our business, and it is not that simple that it's their business. We know better, and survivors of the intimate partner violence need our support to seek help and counseling, and we need to do everything we can to support them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think that was a wealth of information that managed to stay on time. And I wanted to thank all of you for staying with us through the end of this session. The organizers asked me to inform all of you that there is a general strike in Paris tomorrow. And so please be sure to take whichever mode of preferred transportation early so that you can be here on time to hear the opening address by Gabriela Ramos at 9 o'clock. So thank you once again. Oh, yes. Where is it again?